How the serial killer hid in plain sight. Content advisory. This presentation discusses violent crimes, including murder and sexual assault. While graphic details have been minimized, some content may be disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Disclaimer on victim counts. Victim counts in this presentation represent confirmed murders, unless otherwise stated. Many of these killers are suspected of additional crimes that remain unproven. When referencing victim numbers, we rely on officially confirmed cases and clearly label any speculation or unverified claims. Disclaimer on psychological analysis. Psychological interpretations in this presentation are based on expert analysis, documented interviews, and established forensic psychology research. However, the inner workings of these individuals' minds cannot be known with absolute certainty. Where psychological motivations are discussed, they represent the professional assessments of forensic experts and criminal profilers rather than established facts. The neighborhood barbecue was in full swing that warm summer evening. Children's laughter echoed across manicured lawns, while adults gathered around grills, cold drinks in hand, swapping stories about work and weather. Among them stood a man who epitomized suburban normalcy. He wore a pleasant smile, shared recipes for the perfect burger, and made sure everyone's glass stayed full. Neighbors knew him as the guy who volunteered at the local church, the one who always showed up when someone needed help with yard work or moving furniture. He was, by every visible measure, one of the good ones. But beneath that carefully constructed facade lurked something else entirely, something dark, something predatory. Because this same man, the one flipping burgers and telling dad jokes, had murdered multiple people. Their bodies lay hidden, not far from where these good people stood laughing and living their ordinary lives. The predator wasn't lurking in some distant shadow or abandoned building. The killer was right there, shaking hands and asking about your weekend plans. This is perhaps the most terrifying truth about serial killers. They don't always look like the villains we imagine. They don't always act strangely or give off obvious warning signs. Some of the most prolific and brutal murderers in history were people who successfully convinced everyone around them that they were normal, decent, even admirable human beings. They held respectable jobs, they raised families, they served their communities, and they killed, again and again and again. Tonight, we're going to explore the chilling reality of serial killers who hid in plain sight. These are the stories of men who perfected the art of the double life, who wore masks so convincing that even those closest to them never suspected the truth. We'll examine how they did it, why it worked, and what their cases teach us about the nature of predatory behavior. Because understanding how these killers concealed themselves isn't just morbidly fascinating, experts believe this knowledge may help law enforcement and communities recognize warning patterns before more lives are lost. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a journey into the darkest corners of human psychology, where we'll meet the neighbors, the volunteers, the family men, who turned out to be something else entirely. The psychology of the mask. Before we delve into specific cases, we need to understand something fundamental about how certain killers operate. Psychologists have a term for what these individuals do. It's called compartmentalization. This is the ability to separate different aspects of one's life into mental boxes, keeping them so distinct that they never seem to touch or contaminate each other. For most of us, compartmentalization is a healthy coping mechanism. We might separate our work persona from our home persona, becoming more formal and professional at the office while being relaxed and casual with family. That's normal. That's adaptive. But for certain killers, compartmentalization becomes something far more sinister and far more complete. These individuals don't just separate different roles, they create entirely different personalities. There's the public self, the person everyone sees and knows. This version is often charming, helpful, and socially skilled. It's the face they show to neighbors, co-workers, and even family members. Then there's the private self, the predator that emerges when the opportunity arises. This is the part they keep carefully hidden, the part that plans, stalks, and kills. According to forensic psychologists and criminal profilers, the truly frightening aspect is how seamlessly some killers can switch between these personas. One moment they're genuinely engaged in normal social interaction, laughing at jokes, expressing concern for a sick friend, discussing the minutiae of daily life. The next moment, something shifts inside them, and the predator emerges. Then, just as quickly, the mask slides back into place, and they return to being the person everyone thinks they know. This ability to maintain such a convincing facade is often linked to psychopathy. Now, it's important to understand that not all psychopaths are violent, and not all violent criminals are psychopaths. But many of the killers who successfully hide in plain sight exhibit traits consistent with psychopathic personality disorder. These traits include superficial charm, a grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, manipulation, lack of remorse or guilt, shallow emotional responses, and a parasitic lifestyle where they use others for their own benefit. What makes psychopathic killers particularly dangerous is something called the mask of sanity. This phrase, coined by psychiatrist Hervey Cleckley in his groundbreaking 1941 book of the same name, describes how psychopaths can present a completely normal, even appealing exterior while harboring deeply disturbed thoughts and impulses. They understand social norms not because they feel them, but because they've learned to mimic them. They're actors playing the role of a normal person, and some of them are devastatingly effective at it. These killers often possess above-average intelligence, which they use to study and replicate normal human behavior. They watch how people react to tragedy and learn to fake the appropriate emotional response. They observe what makes someone trustworthy and adopt those characteristics. They're essentially emotional frauds, counterfeiting feelings they don't actually experience to blend into society. There's also typically a strong element of narcissism at play. Research suggests that many of these killers believe they're fundamentally superior to others, that ordinary rules don't apply to them. This grandiosity fuels both their crimes and their confidence that they won't be caught. They think they're smarter than law enforcement, cleverer than their neighbors, more cunning than anyone who might suspect them. And sometimes, terrifyingly, they're right, at least for a while. Another crucial factor is the element of control. According to forensic psychologists and criminal profilers, many serial killers are primarily motivated by a need for power and dominance rather than sexual gratification alone. But maintaining a normal facade requires control as well, just a different kind. They must control their impulses in public, control their words and expressions, control the information others have access to. Research suggests this need for control may extend to every aspect of their lives, creating an existence that is simultaneously meticulously organized and horrifyingly violent. The social context matters too. Research has shown that these killers often thrive in environments where people want to trust each other, where the default assumption is that your neighbor, your co-worker, your fellow church member is basically good. They exploit our desire to see the best in people, using our own optimism and communal trust against us. In tight-knit communities where everyone knows everyone else, the cognitive dissonance of suspecting someone familiar can be overwhelming. Our brains resist believing that someone we know could be capable of such horrors. It's also worth noting that many of these killers insert themselves into positions that inherently command trust. They become teachers, coaches, volunteers, religious leaders, roles that society has been conditioned to respect and trust. These positions provide not only cover but also access to potential victims. They create situations where questioning someone's motives feels somehow inappropriate or even offensive. The phenomenon of hiding in plain sight reveals something uncomfortable about human nature and social dynamics. We rely on shortcuts and assumptions to navigate our social worlds. We can't deeply investigate every person we interact with, so we use surface indicators. Does this person seem normal? Do they fit in? Do others vouch for them? To make quick judgments about trustworthiness. Serial killers who successfully hide in plain sight have figured out how to game this system, presenting exactly the right indicators while concealing their true nature. Understanding these psychological mechanisms is crucial not just for law enforcement, but for anyone who wants to better understand how predatory individuals operate. Experts emphasize that while we cannot always identify dangerous individuals by appearance or surface behavior, awareness of these patterns can contribute to improved community safety and more effective investigation strategies. Now, with this psychological framework in mind, let's examine specific cases that illustrate these principles in action. We'll start with a man who maintained his cover for over 30 years, fooling his family, his friends, his church congregation, and his entire community while committing some of the most brutal murders in American history. Dennis Rader, the church president with a terrible secret. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburg, Kansas, the first of 4 sons born to Dorothea May Cook and William Elvin Rader. His father worked for Kansas Gas Service and was a former United States Marine. His mother worked as a bookkeeper. The family attended Zion Lutheran Church in Pittsburgh, where Dennis was baptized as an infant. By all external appearances, the Rader family was typical of countless American families in the post-war era, working class, church-going, and unremarkable. His childhood appeared outwardly normal, though he would later claim, and it's important to note these are his own self-serving claims, that he'd been born with violent sexual fantasies. Psychologists note that such claims often serve to minimize personal responsibility and should be understood within that context. Rader would also later claim to have tortured and killed animals as a child, including hanging stray cats, though the extent of these early behaviors remains difficult to verify independently. As a young man, Rader seemed unremarkable. He joined the United States Air Force in 1966, serving until 1970 and achieving the rank of sergeant. During his service, he received training and experience that would later prove useful in his crimes: discipline, attention to detail, and the ability to follow procedures meticulously. He returned to Kansas after his service and attended Wichita State University, eventually earning a degree in administration of justice in 1979. The irony of a serial killer studying criminal justice would later be noted by many observers. It was during this period that he met Paula Dietz, who worked as a secretary for the American Legion. They married on May 22, 1971, in a ceremony held at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita, the same church where Rader would later become a pillar of the congregation. Together, they would have 2 children, a son, Brian, born in 1975, and a daughter, Kerry, born in 1978. By all outward appearances, Dennis Rader was building a stable, respectable life. He worked as an assembler for the Coleman Company, a manufacturer of outdoor recreational products. He attended church regularly at Christ Lutheran Church, becoming increasingly involved in the congregation. He was active in the Boy Scouts, serving as a troop leader. He was, by every metric his neighbors could see, a good man, perhaps a bit rigid and particular about rules, but certainly not dangerous. In 1974, Rader obtained a position with ADT Security Services, installing home security systems. The irony would later be almost unbearable for his clients and community. The man charged with protecting their homes was the very threat they sought protection from. Co-workers at ADT nicknamed him Blue Book Man because he always followed the rules meticulously and scolded others for even making small talk during work hours. He worked this job for several years before joining the Park City Compliance Department in 1991, where he became a code enforcement officer, essentially a bureaucrat who enforced city ordinances, wrote citations for code violations, and measured grass that was too long. This position suited Rader perfectly. It gave him a modicum of authority, allowed him to enter people's properties, and provided a legitimate reason to be driving through neighborhoods, observing homes and residents. His co-workers would later describe him as officious, someone who relished his small amount of power, perhaps a bit too much. He was known to be inflexible about rules, measuring lawns with precision and issuing citations for even minor violations. He reportedly chased stray animals while carrying a tranquilizer gun, taking his duties perhaps more seriously than necessary. But overzealousness about city codes didn't make someone a murderer. It just made them annoying. Rader's involvement with Christ Lutheran Church deepened over the years. He served in various capacities, eventually becoming the congregation president in January 2005. He was responsible for administrative duties, congregation meetings, church finances. He was trusted with the most mundane and intimate details of church operations. People confided in him about their struggles, their doubts, their fears. He counseled them, prayed with them, presented himself as a pillar of faith and community. But there was another Dennis Rader, a secret Dennis Rader, one that had been active since January 15, 1974. On that frigid winter morning, the Otero family went about their normal routines in their Wichita home. Joseph Otero, age 38, worked for the Coleman Company, the same company where Rader had briefly worked. Julie Otero, age 34, was his devoted wife. They had 5 children together, building the kind of family life that represented the American dream. That morning, 9-year-old Joseph Jr., 11-year-old Josephine, and their siblings were in various states of waking up for school. Dennis Rader had been watching the house. He'd seen the family's routines, knew their schedules. According to his later confessions, he had been stalking Julie Otero since December 1973, apparently developing an obsession with her. When he knocked on the door that morning, the Oteros let him in, perhaps believing he needed help, perhaps thinking he was from the telephone company, as he would later claim to have told them. Once inside, he revealed his true intentions. Using weapons he'd brought with him, Rader methodically restrained the family members. He killed Joseph Otero Sr. by strangulation with a cord. He killed Julie Otero the same way. 9-year-old Joey was also strangled. The systematic nature of the murders stood in stark contrast to any image of passion or sudden rage. This was calculated, planned, methodical. Then, Rader took 11-year-old Josephine to the basement, where he killed her. The crime scene was staged in a way that suggested sexual motivation, though Rader's actual intent was about power and control. When investigators arrived at the Otero home later that day, after family members discovered the bodies, they found a scene of calculated brutality that would haunt the Wichita community for decades. The community was shocked. The Oteros were a good family, well-liked, with no apparent enemies. Who would do such a thing? Why would anyone target an entire family, including children? The randomness of it made it even more terrifying. If the Oteros could be victims, anyone could. But after committing these horrific murders, Dennis Rader didn't flee the state or go into hiding. He went home to his wife Paula, who was pregnant with their first child. He went to work at the Coleman Company. He attended church. He helped neighbors. He lived his normal life as if nothing had happened. He even took a watch from the Otero home as a souvenir, beginning a pattern he would continue throughout his killing career. This ability to commit savage murder and then seamlessly return to mundane normalcy is what Rader would later describe, using his own terminology, as cubing. Though forensic psychologists note this is his own term for what is clinically known as dissociation or extreme compartmentalization. He claimed to be able to separate his life into distinct compartments that never touched: work Dennis, church Dennis, family Dennis, and what he called his Factor X, or his demon. Experts emphasize that such self-serving explanations should be viewed critically, as they often serve to minimize the killer's responsibility for their conscious choices. 3 months after the Otero murders, on April 4, 1974, Rader struck again. Catherine Bright, a 21-year-old woman who also worked at the Coleman Company, was home with her brother Kevin when Rader broke in. He shot Kevin Bright, who survived despite serious injuries and would later provide descriptions to police. Rader then murdered Catherine by stabbing her multiple times. The attack was brutal and prolonged. Catherine fought for her life, sustaining numerous defensive wounds before succumbing to her injuries. Kevin Bright's survival and his ability to describe the attacker should have led to Rader's capture, but somehow the investigation didn't connect him to the crime. Then, something happened that would define the BTK case for the next 30 years. Dennis Rader wanted credit for his crimes. He wanted recognition. He wanted people to know what he'd done and to acknowledge his work. On October 22, 1974, a Wichita Eagle reporter received a phone call directing him to a book at the Wichita Public Library. Inside that book was a letter describing the Otero murders in detail that only the killer could know. The letter was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone, describing the crimes as though they were ordinary events. At the bottom, the author had provided a name for himself: BTK, bind, torture, kill. The letter stated, "The code words for me will be bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK." This would become his signature. Over the years, BTK would send numerous letters to media outlets and police, taunting them, providing details of murders, sometimes sending items belonging to victims. He seemed to crave the attention, the notoriety, the knowledge that the entire city was talking about him, even though they didn't know who he was. But despite this correspondence, BTK would remain unidentified for decades. And during those decades, Dennis Rader continued his double life. In 1975, his son Brian was born. Rader was present for the birth, a devoted father from the start. He coached Brian in Little League, attended his school events, helped with homework. Brian would later describe his father as strict but loving, someone who enforced rules but also spent quality time with his children. Rader killed again in 1977. On March 17th, Shirley Vian, a 26-year-old mother of 3 young children, was murdered in her home. Shirley was sick with the flu that day, lying in bed when Rader forced his way into the house. He told her children, ages 5, 7, and 8, that he was wanted by the police and needed to hide. He locked them in the bathroom, telling them he would harm their mother if they came out or made noise. The children huddled together in terror, hearing sounds from outside, but not understanding what was happening. Rader killed Shirley in her bedroom while her children waited just feet away. When he left, the children eventually emerged to find their mother dead. The psychological trauma inflicted on these children, who survived but lost their mother in such a terrifying way, is immeasurable. On December 8, 1977, Rader broke into the home of Nancy Fox, a 25-year-old woman who lived alone. Nancy worked at a jewelry store and was known for her friendly personality. Rader killed her by strangulation with a belt. Then, in a display of his twisted arrogance, he used her own phone to call the police and report the homicide, directing them to her address. He wanted them to find his work. He wanted credit. The phone call was brief and matter-of-fact, demonstrating his complete lack of remorse or emotional connection to his victim. After the Fox murder, BTK went silent. Not because he'd stopped thinking about killing, not because he'd experienced remorse, but because, as he would later explain, his life circumstances had changed in ways that made murder more difficult. In 1978, his daughter Kerry was born. His children were growing up. His wife was more aware of his movements. His job demanded more of his time. The compartmentalization required more effort. But he didn't forget. He kept souvenirs from his victims, photographs, identification cards, items of clothing. He revisited these items regularly, using them to relive his crimes in his imagination. He would later admit to creating elaborate fantasies and even detailed drawings of potential future victims during this dormant period. The years passed. 1978, 1979, 1980. No new BTK murders. Wichita began to relax slightly, though the terror of those few years in the mid-1970s had never truly faded. Parents still warned children. Women still checked their locks obsessively, but life moved on as it must. The BTK task force remained active, but with diminishing resources as other crimes demanded attention. Then, in 1985, BTK resurfaced. On April 27th, Maureen Hedge, a 53-year-old neighbor of Rader's, was killed in her home. Maureen lived just 6 doors down from the Rader family on the same street. Rader had watched her, knew her routines. He broke in during the night, killed her, removed her body to take photographs in a remote location, and then returned the body to her home. The level of planning and risk-taking indicated a killer who felt completely confident in his ability to evade capture. The fact that he targeted his own neighbor demonstrated his complete lack of fear and his belief in his own superiority. On September 16, 1986, Vicki Wegerle, a 28-year-old woman, was murdered in her home, while her young 2-year-old son was present in another room. Vicki was a pianist and homemaker. Rader had posed as a telephone repairman to gain entry, part of what he would later call Project Piano. After killing Vicky, he left as calmly as he'd arrived, confident that his disguise and planning had protected his identity. Her murder wouldn't be officially connected to BTK until years later. The final confirmed BTK murder occurred on January 19, 1991. Dolores Davis, a 62-year-old woman, was abducted from her home, killed with her own pantyhose, and her body left under a bridge. Dolores was a beloved grandmother in the community. After this murder, BTK went silent again. For 13 years, there were no letters, no communications, no confirmed killings. The case grew cold. Investigators retired. The city moved on, though the shadow of BTK never entirely lifted. During all these years, Dennis Rader lived his normal life with remarkable success. He raised his children. Brian and Kerry Rader had a father who attended their school events, helped with homework, enforced household rules with perhaps more rigidity than most parents, but nothing that seemed abnormal. They had family dinners, they went on vacations, they celebrated birthdays and holidays. Paula Rader had a husband who went to work, came home, handled household repairs, and seemed like a typical middle-aged man settled into the routines of suburban life. If she noticed anything unusual, she didn't recognize it as evidence of murder. His co-workers at the Park City Compliance Office knew Dennis Rader as the guy who took his job very seriously, maybe too seriously. He was meticulous about city codes, inflexible about enforcement, the kind of person who'd measure your grass with a ruler and write a citation if it exceeded the permitted height by half an inch. Some found him irritating. Others thought he was just doing his job thoroughly. No one thought he was a serial killer. His church congregation knew him as Brother Dennis, devoted to Christ Lutheran Church, always present at services, reliable for administrative tasks, eventually trusted enough to become congregation president. He led council meetings. He managed church finances. He represented the congregation in community interfaith activities. He was, by all accounts, a dedicated member of the Christian community. But in 2004, after 13 years of silence, BTK suddenly began communicating again. The Wichita Eagle ran a story marking the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders, and Rader would later explain that he was kind of bored and concerned that his work would be forgotten. Investigators believe his need for recognition overcame his caution. He began sending letters to media outlets again, including items from old crime scenes to prove his identity. What followed was a cat-and-mouse game between BTK and law enforcement. Rader sent numerous communications over the next year, some in cereal boxes, possibly a reference to serial killer, containing drawings, photographs, written descriptions of murders, and even dolls posed to mimic his victims. He seemed to be playing a game, testing the police, enjoying the renewed attention his crimes were receiving. In one of his communications, Rader made a fatal error. He asked police if they could trace information on a floppy disk. The police, hoping to encourage him to send a disk, lied and said no, they couldn't trace it. Trusting this response and displaying a surprising naivety for someone who'd evaded capture for 30 years, Rader sent a purple floppy disk to a television station. Forensic analysts examined the disk and found deleted metadata that included the name Dennis and a connection to Christ Lutheran Church. This led investigators directly to Dennis Rader. They obtained a DNA sample from his daughter Kerry's medical records at a university clinic. She had had a routine pap smear, and compared it to DNA evidence from the crime scenes. The match was conclusive. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested outside his home in Park City, Kansas, on his lunch break from his compliance officer job. When asked if he knew why he was being arrested, Rader reportedly responded, "Oh, I have suspicions why." Even in the moment of his capture, there was an almost casual quality to his demeanor, as if being arrested for serial murder was just another item on his day's schedule. The arrest shocked everyone who knew him. His family was devastated. Paula Rader filed for an immediate emergency divorce on July 26, 2005, waiving the normal 60-day waiting period. Their marriage was dissolved as quickly as the legal system allowed. She released a statement saying that neither she nor her children had any suspicion of his crimes. The psychological trauma of discovering that the man she'd been married to for 34 years was BTK is difficult to comprehend. Their children, now adults, had to reconcile the father they'd known with the serial killer he actually was. Brian and Kerry Rader have largely stayed out of public life since their father's arrest, attempting to build lives separate from the horror of his legacy. Kerry Rawson, she took her married name, eventually wrote a book in 2019 titled A Serial Killer's Daughter, My Story of Faith, Love, and Overcoming, and participated in the 2025 Netflix documentary My Father, the BTK Killer, where she shared her quest for answers and healing. In letters Rader wrote to Kerry from jail, he showed a disturbing mix of fatherly affection and complete lack of genuine remorse. He wrote things like, "You will always be my baby girl, I raised right, and life before the arrest was a good time, and the dark side took me away," as if his murders were something that happened to him rather than choices he made. Kerry described the agonizing process of trying to reconcile the loving father she remembered with the killer he actually was. The congregation at Christ Lutheran Church was stunned. This man they'd trusted, who'd managed their church, who'd represented their faith community, he'd been BTK all along. Some members struggled with profound questions about faith, about how they could have been so thoroughly deceived, about what it meant that they'd prayed alongside a serial killer. Rader's co-workers reported feeling disturbed and betrayed. They'd worked alongside him for years, shared breaks with him, attended office parties with him. The code enforcement officer who measured grass and wrote parking tickets had murdered 10 people. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. During his interrogation and subsequent court proceedings, Rader was unnervingly cooperative and detailed in describing his crimes. He showed no genuine remorse, instead seeming almost proud of his ability to have hidden for so long. He explained his methods, his planning, his motivations with a clinical detachment that forensic psychologists found characteristic of psychopathic personality disorder. He spoke about his victims as though they were objects, projects he'd completed. He detailed his trolling process, how he'd search for potential victims, how he'd plan his attacks, how he'd relive the crimes through his souvenirs. On June 27, 2005, Rader pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. On August 18, 2005, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms in prison, one for each of his confirmed victims. Kansas had no death penalty at the time his crimes were committed, so life imprisonment was the maximum sentence. He will never be eligible for parole. He is currently incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he will remain for the rest of his natural life. The BTK case represents one of the most disturbing examples of a serial killer successfully hiding in plain sight. For over 30 years, Dennis Rader maintained a completely normal public existence, while secretly being one of America's most brutal killers. His ability to compartmentalize, to separate his murderous activities from his daily life, allowed him to fool everyone around him: his family, his church, his community, his co-workers. When people think about serial killers, they often imagine someone who looks or acts obviously disturbed. But Dennis Rader looked like everyone's neighbor. He looked like a church leader. He looked like a typical middle-aged man living an ordinary life in the heartland of America. And that's precisely what made him so dangerous and so successful at evading capture for so long. The victims of BTK deserve to be remembered as more than just entries in a killer's ledger. Joseph Otero, age 38, was a loving father who'd brought his family to Wichita for better opportunities. Julie Otero, age 34, was a devoted mother who worked at the Coleman Company. Joseph Otero Jr., age 9, loved baseball and had his whole life ahead of him. Josephine Otero, age 11, was a bright student with a promising future. Catherine Bright, age 21, was starting her adult life with hopes and dreams. Shirley Vian, age 26, was a mother doing her best to raise 3 young children. Nancy Fox, age 25, was independent and hardworking. Maureen Hedge, age 53, was a kind neighbor. Vicki Wegel, age 28, was a talented pianist and mother. Dolores Davis, age 62, was a beloved grandmother in her community. They were people with families, hopes, dreams, and futures that Dennis Rader stole from them. Their names and their humanity must be remembered alongside the story of the man who killed them. John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown, next door. If Dennis Rader represents the mundane killer hiding in plain sight, the ordinary bureaucrat who happened to be a murderer, then John Wayne Gacy represents something even more disturbing: the beloved community figure, the charitable volunteer, the man who brought joy to children and sick people through his clown performances. Gacy was popular, well-liked, and respected in his community. He was also responsible for the deaths of 33 young men and boys, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, the second of 3 children born to John Stanley Gacy and Marion Elaine Robinson. His childhood was marked by complexity and dysfunction, though like many serial killers, external observers might not have recognized the depth of problems within the family home. Gacy's father was an alcoholic who frequently abused his wife and children, both physically and verbally. Young John was often the target of his father's rage and disappointment. The elder Gacy belittled his son, calling him stupid and worthless, comparing him unfavorably to his sisters, and questioning his masculinity. He would beat John with a leather strap for real or perceived infractions. Psychological experts note that this abuse likely contributed to Gacy's later need to prove his worth and earn approval. Though many people experience childhood abuse without becoming killers, and abuse does not excuse or fully explain criminal behavior. Despite these difficulties, Gacy worked hard to present a normal exterior. He was involved in extracurricular activities at school, worked various jobs as a teenager to contribute to the family finances, and seemed to be making efforts to build a stable life. He struggled with health issues, including a heart condition that would cause him to be hospitalized multiple times during his youth and would later exempt him from military service during the Vietnam War era. In 1964, at age 22, Gacy married Marlyn Myers, whose father owned a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa. Gacy moved to Waterloo with his bride and began working for his father-in-law, managing one of the restaurants. He threw himself into community involvement, joining the JCs, the Junior Chamber of Commerce, a civic organization for young professionals, and quickly becoming known as an enthusiastic volunteer and hard worker. He was elected vice president of the Waterloo JCs chapter and was named outstanding vice president of the organization in Iowa. He seemed to finally be building the kind of respectable life his father had always claimed he couldn't achieve. On the surface, Gacy appeared to be thriving. He and Marlyn had 2 children, a son and daughter. He was successful in business, rising to manage multiple restaurant locations. He was active in community service, known for his dedication and work ethic. He was making something of himself. But beneath this successful exterior, Gacy was engaging in disturbing behavior. He had sexual encounters with teenage boys, sometimes employees at the restaurants he managed. He would ply them with alcohol and then commit sexual acts. In 1968, one of these encounters led to criminal charges when a teenage boy, the son of a fellow JC's member, reported that Gacy had sexually assaulted him. When the case went to trial, Gacy was convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in prison at the Iowa State Reformatory. Marlyn divorced him while he was incarcerated, and he lost contact with his children. His father died shortly after his conviction, reportedly disgusted by his son's crimes. Gacy never got the chance to prove himself to his father. Most people might assume this would be the end of the story. A sex offender caught, punished, and removed from society. But Gacy was a model prisoner. He earned his high school equivalency diploma while incarcerated. He worked in the prison kitchen and was praised for his leadership and work ethic. He served on the Prisoner Grievance Committee. He was, by all accounts, rehabilitated. After serving just 18 months of his 10-year sentence, he was paroled in June 1970. What happened next illustrates a profound failure in the criminal justice system's ability to predict recidivism in certain types of offenders. Gacy moved back to Chicago and started over. He reconnected with his mother and eventually moved to Norwood Park Township, a middle-class neighborhood on the northwest side of Chicago. In 1971, he bought a home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, a modest ranch-style house that would later become infamous. Gacy started a construction company, PDM Contractors, named for painting, decorating, and maintenance. He was skilled at construction work, having learned carpentry and other trades from his father, and quickly built a successful business. He hired teenage boys and young men to work for him, often recruiting from local high schools or targeting those from troubled backgrounds who might be less likely to be missed if they disappeared. He paid them fairly and treated them reasonably, though some would later report that he could be volatile and inappropriate. In 1972, Gacy married again. Carol Hoff was a divorcee with 2 young daughters. She'd known Gacy years earlier when they both worked at the same company, and when they reconnected after his release from prison, he seemed like a stable man who'd made a mistake in his youth but had turned his life around. They married in July 1972, and Gacy became a stepfather to Carol's daughters, presenting himself as a family man and provider. He became deeply involved in community activities. He joined the local Moose Club and other civic organizations. He began performing as a clown at children's parties, hospitals, and charitable events, creating characters he called Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown. He would dress in full clown makeup and costume, bringing smiles to sick children in hospitals and entertaining at neighborhood block parties and fundraisers. Gacy's clown performances made him well known in the community. People loved him. He was the generous guy who gave his time to make children happy, who volunteered for the Democratic Party, who organized fundraisers and community events. He was photographed with local politicians and civic leaders. In 1978, he even met First Lady Rosalind Carter at a Polish Constitution Day parade event in Chicago, where he was serving as director of the annual parade. The photograph of Gacy with the First Lady would later become one of the most shocking images associated with the case, a serial killer smiling alongside the wife of the President of the United States. But during this same period, John Wayne Gacy was also murdering young men and boys at a horrific rate. According to Gacy's later confession, his first murder as an adult occurred on January 3, 1972, in the early morning hours. Timothy McCoy was a 16-year-old who'd been traveling through Chicago by bus. Gacy encountered him at the Greyhound bus station, offered him a place to stay, and brought him to his Summerdale Avenue home. There, Gacy killed him. Gacy would later claim that Timothy had come at him with a knife and that he'd killed in self-defense, but investigators found no evidence to support this claim and believe it was another of Gacy's many lies. After this murder, Gacy realized something that would define his subsequent actions. He could kill and get away with it. The body could be hidden. The victim's disappearance wouldn't necessarily be connected to him. He could continue his normal life as if nothing had happened, and that's exactly what he did. Gacy developed a methodical approach to murder. He would target young men and boys, often those who worked for him or whom he met through his business or community activities. He would lure them to his house under various pretexts, offering work, showing them something, providing a place to stay, or sometimes simply inviting them to drink or party. Once there, he would gain control of them through trickery, force, or by offering them alcohol or drugs. Gacy would then incapacitate his victims, often by using what he called his handcuff trick. He'd claim to be showing them a magic trick or illusion where he could escape from handcuffs and would get them to allow him to put the cuffs on them. Once the victim was restrained, Gacy's true nature would emerge. He would commit sexual assault and eventually kill them, most often through strangulation, using a rope or board twisted by a stick, a method called garroting. The methodical nature of his crimes stood in stark contrast to his public persona as a community leader and entertainer. After each murder, Gacy faced the problem of body disposal. His solution was grimly practical and horrifyingly simple. He buried them under his house. The crawl space beneath his home became a graveyard. As the years went on and the body count increased, Gacy would dig new graves in his crawl space, sometimes even stacking bodies or digging up old graves to make room for new victims. Eventually, when the crawl space became too full, Gacy began disposing of bodies in other ways. He threw 4 victims into the Des Plaines River, but for the most part, the bodies of his victims were buried beneath his home, decomposing just feet below where he lived his normal life, where he hosted parties, where his wife and stepdaughters slept. During the period from 1972 to 1978, while Gacy was actively killing, his public life continued seemingly without any disruption. He entertained at parties as Pogo the Clown, bringing joy to children at birthday parties and hospital wards. He ran his successful construction business, completing jobs professionally and earning a good reputation. He supervised employees, attended political events, volunteered for community causes. He was, to all external appearances, a successful, generous, community-minded citizen. His wife, Carol, did eventually become suspicious of Gacy's behavior, though not of murder. She noticed strange smells in the house. Gacy blamed it on moisture in the crawl space or problems with the plumbing. She noticed his strange hours, his volatile mood swings, and the fact that their sexual relationship had essentially ceased. She also discovered pornographic materials featuring young men hidden in the house. In March 1976, Carol and Gacy divorced, with Carol taking her daughters and leaving. Years later, she would express her relief that her daughters had not been harmed and her horror at discovering who Gacy truly was. She would say that she had no idea about the murders, and investigators found no evidence that she did. After the divorce, with no family living in the house with him, Gacy's killing accelerated. Without a wife to explain things to or hide things from, he had more freedom to act on his violent urges. The bodies continued to accumulate beneath his home, yet he continued his community involvement unabated. Gacy hosted elaborate annual summer parties at his home, inviting neighbors, political figures, business associates. These parties became well known in the neighborhood, with people looking forward to them each year. Guests would stand on the lawn, eating and drinking, socializing and laughing, with 29 bodies buried just below their feet. The cognitive dissonance of this, the friendly party happening literally above a mass grave, is almost incomprehensible. Neighbors on Summerdale Avenue thought Gacy was a bit odd. He could be volatile, and there were sometimes unpleasant smells around his property. Some young men were seen coming and going at odd hours, but mostly they saw him as a helpful neighbor, someone who'd plow snow from driveways or help with home repairs. He was familiar. He was part of the community. He certainly wasn't a serial killer. The investigation that would eventually catch Gacy began not with any of his earlier victims, but with his last. On December 11, 1978, 15-year-old Robert Peast told his mother he was going to meet with a contractor about a potential summer job. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy, who'd come into the pharmacy where Robert's mother worked to discuss a remodeling project. Robert was excited about the opportunity. He never came home. Robert's mother immediately reported him missing and mentioned that he'd been going to meet with Gacy. Unlike many of Gacy's previous victims, young men from troubled backgrounds, drifters, runaways, or those who might not be immediately missed, Robert Peast was a well-cared-for teenager from a stable, loving family. His disappearance was taken seriously from the beginning, and police quickly began investigating Gacy. What they found was disturbing. Gacy had a criminal history, the 1968 conviction for sexual assault in Iowa. He'd been in prison. He was on parole that he shouldn't have even been off of yet, and now a teenage boy had disappeared after going to meet him. Investigators began surveillance on Gacy and started looking deeper into his background. They discovered that several young men who'd worked for PDM contractors had disappeared over the years. On December 21, 1978, after obtaining a search warrant based on the mounting evidence, police searched Gacy's home. What they found there would shock the nation. The smell of decomposition was overwhelming. Investigators began searching the crawl space and discovered human remains. As the excavation continued over the following days, more and more bodies were found. Eventually, 26 bodies were recovered from the crawl space, and 3 more were found buried in other areas on the property. 4 bodies that Gacy had disposed of in the Des Plaines River were also eventually identified, bringing the total known victim count to 33. On December 22, 1978, John Wayne Gacy confessed to the murders. He did so in a relatively matter-of-fact manner, providing details about his methods, his burial sites, and his victims. Forensic psychologists who have studied his confessions and later interviews note that he displayed little genuine remorse and seemed more concerned with managing his public image than with accepting responsibility for the harm he'd caused. The revelation that John Wayne Gacy, Pogo the Clown, community volunteer, successful businessman, was responsible for 33 murders shocked the Chicago area and the nation. People who'd known him, who'd attended his parties, who'd hired him for work, who'd had their children entertained by his clown performances, struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the brutal killer he'd been revealed to be. The excavation of Gacy's home became a media spectacle. News crews broadcast images of investigators digging up bodies from beneath the house. The Summerdale Avenue address became infamous. Neighbors gathered behind police tape, trying to comprehend how such horror had existed right next door to them. The trial began on February 6, 1980. Gacy's defense attempted to argue that he was insane, that he suffered from multiple personality disorder, that he couldn't have been responsible for his actions. His lawyers presented psychiatric testimony suggesting that another personality named Jack Hanley had committed the murders while Gacy was unaware. But the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of premeditation, planning, and rational behavior surrounding the murders. The prosecution argued that Gacy knew exactly what he was doing, that he was organized and calculating, and that he made conscious choices to kill repeatedly. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding Gacy guilty on all 33 counts of murder. On March 13, 1980, he was sentenced to death for 12 of the murders. He would spend the next 14 years on death row, during which time he gave numerous interviews, painted pictures, some of clowns, which would later be sold or destroyed, and continued to maintain his innocence despite his earlier confession. John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Crestwood, Illinois, on May 10, 1994, at 12:58 a.m. He was 52 years old. His last words were reported to be "kiss my ass." Even in death, he showed no genuine remorse for his crimes. Outside the prison, crowds gathered, some celebrating, some protesting the death penalty. His execution was seen by many as justice finally served for the 33 young men and boys whose lives he'd taken. After Gacy's execution, his house on Summerdale Avenue was demolished in April 1979, shortly after the bodies were removed. The lot remained empty for years, as no one wanted to buy property so thoroughly associated with horror. Eventually, a new house was built on the site, and a new family moved in, trying to establish normal life in a place that had been the setting for unspeakable crimes. The Gacy case represents perhaps the most extreme example of a serial killer successfully hiding in plain sight. He wasn't just maintaining a normal appearance, he was actively beloved by his community. Children loved Pogo the Clown. Neighbors appreciated his helpfulness. Politicians valued his volunteer work. Business associates found him reliable and skilled. The Democratic Party welcomed his participation in political events and fundraisers. And all the while, beneath his house, the bodies accumulated. 29 young men and boys buried in the crawl space, their decomposing bodies just feet below where parties were held, where guests socialized, where life went on as normal. The duality of Gacy's existence, beloved community figure by day, brutal killer by night, challenges our fundamental assumptions about how we identify dangerous people. If someone as active, public, and seemingly generous as John Wayne Gacy could be a serial killer, then our methods for identifying threats are fundamentally inadequate. The victims of John Wayne Gacy deserve to be remembered as individuals, not just statistics. Timothy McCoy, age 16, was traveling through Chicago with his whole life ahead of him. John Butkovich, age 17, worked for Gacy and disappeared in 1975. Darrell Sampson, age 18, was a high school student. Randall Reffett, age 15, vanished in 1976. Samuel Stapleton, age 14, was a junior high student. These young men had families who loved them, dreams they wanted to pursue, potential that was stolen from them. Some of Gacy's victims remain unidentified even today, their families perhaps still wondering what happened to their missing sons or brothers. Robert Peast, whose disappearance finally led to Gacy's capture, was 15 years old. He was a good student, close to his family, excited about a potential job opportunity. His mother never stopped looking for him, and her determination to find her son ultimately led to the investigation that brought Gacy down. The Piast family's persistence in pursuing answers when Robert disappeared demonstrates the importance of taking every missing person case seriously, regardless of the victim's background. Ted Bundy, the charming predator. Theodore Robert Bundy, born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, would become one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Unlike Rader or Gacy, Bundy's good looks, education, and charm made him seem like the last person who would be capable of murder. He was handsome, articulate, intelligent, and seemingly destined for a successful career in law or politics, and he confessed to murdering at least 30 young women, though investigators believe the actual number is higher, with estimates ranging up to 35 or more based on circumstantial evidence and unsolved cases from the areas where Bundy traveled. Bundy's early life was complicated by secrets and deception that psychological experts believe may have shaped his development, though, as always, difficult circumstances don't excuse behavior or determine outcomes. He was born to Eleanor Louise Cowell, an unmarried woman in the 1940s, a status that carried severe social stigma at the time. To avoid scandal, Bundy was raised in his grandparents' home in Philadelphia, with the understanding that his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his older sister. He wouldn't learn the truth about his parentage until he was an adolescent, discovering the deception through a cousin, or possibly by finding his birth certificate. Accounts vary. His biological father's identity remains uncertain. His birth certificate lists Lloyd Marshall as his father, but this is believed to be false. His mother later married Johnny Bundy, and Theodore took his stepfather's surname. The family moved to Washington State when Ted was 4 years old, where young Ted grew up in what appeared to be a normal, middle-class environment in Tacoma. Bundy was intelligent and did well academically, though he was sometimes described as shy and less popular than his peers in his early school years. He attended the University of Washington, where he studied Chinese and later psychology. He was involved in politics, volunteering for Republican campaigns and working on political causes. He worked at a crisis hotline at a suicide prevention center in Seattle, where he met and befriended Anne Rule, who was also volunteering there. Rule would later become a famous true crime writer, and her book, The Stranger Beside Me, would detail her friendship with Bundy and her slow, horrifying realization that her friend was a serial killer. She would describe him as a good listener, someone who genuinely seemed to care about helping people in crisis, a testament to how convincing his mask was. Bundy appeared to be a young man with a bright future. He was studying law at the University of Utah, considering politics, and seemed to have the intelligence, charm, and ambition to succeed in whatever path he chose. Those who knew him described him as polite, well-spoken, and trustworthy. He had a long-term girlfriend, Elizabeth Kendall, who wrote under the pseudonym Elizabeth Klopfer and seemed to be in a stable relationship. But beneath this promising exterior, something far darker was developing. During his college years, Bundy became involved in a relationship with a woman from a wealthy California family. Various sources refer to her by different names, including Stephanie Brooks and Diane Edwards. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and came from a privileged background. Psychological experts have theorized that this relationship and its eventual end may have served as a catalyst for his later crimes, though Bundy himself provided contradictory explanations for his violence. The woman broke up with Bundy reportedly because she felt he lacked direction and ambition. This rejection occurred in 1968, and some psychologists believe it was a significant blow to Bundy's ego and may have contributed to his later targeting of women who resembled her. Though the reality is that while relationships can be difficult and even traumatic, they don't transform someone into a serial killer. That darkness must already exist. After this relationship ended, Bundy appeared to transform himself. He became more confident, more socially successful. He re-enrolled in law school. He reconnected with his former girlfriend in California, and they briefly rekindled their relationship in 1973, by which point experts believe he had already begun killing, though this woman didn't know it. She would later say that he seemed more mature and focused, not realizing that his new confidence came partly from his secret life as a predator. Bundy's earliest documented murders occurred in 1974, though there is speculation he may have killed before this. Investigators have suspected him in the 1961 disappearance of 8-year-old Anne-Marie Burr from her home in Tacoma, though Bundy consistently denied this, and no evidence has ever conclusively linked him to that case. What is certain is that by 1974, Bundy had begun a murder spree that would span multiple states and claim at least 30 confirmed victims. He developed a method that became his trademark. He would approach young women in public places, often college campuses or parks, pretending to be injured or in need of help. He might wear a fake cast on his arm or leg, or use crutches and ask for assistance, carrying books or loading items into his Volkswagen Beetle. The cast or injury made him seem harmless, even vulnerable. Once the woman was near his vehicle and distracted, he would incapacitate her, sometimes by hitting her with a crowbar or tire iron that he had hidden, force her into the car, and drive to a remote location where he would assault and kill her. Bundy typically targeted young women with long, dark hair parted in the middle, a look similar to his former girlfriend from California. Psychological analysts have theorized that Bundy was symbolically murdering this woman over and over, though this remains speculation rather than confirmed fact, and Bundy himself gave different explanations at different times. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy is confirmed to have killed at least 30 women across Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, and Florida. He would later admit that he frequently returned to disposal sites, engaging in acts of necrophilia, a behavior documented in his confessions to investigators and consistent with his need for continued control over his victims even after death. What made Bundy particularly dangerous and successful was his appearance and demeanor. He didn't look like a killer, he looked like a law student, which he actually was at various points. He looked like someone's helpful neighbor. He looked like a nice young man who might genuinely need assistance with a broken leg or heavy books. He was articulate, educated, and charming. Women felt comfortable approaching him, helping him, trusting him, and that trust was fatal. Some of Bundy's victims from the Washington and Oregon period in 1974 included Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old psychology student who disappeared from her basement bedroom, leaving behind a blood-soaked pillow and nightgown. Donna Gail Manson, 19, vanished from the Evergreen State College campus. Susan Rancourt, 18, disappeared from Central Washington State College. Roberta Kathleen Parks, 20, was last seen at Oregon State University. Brenda Ball, 22, and Georgianne Hawkins, 18, also disappeared during this period. In July 1974, in one of Bundy's most brazen acts, he abducted two women, Janice Ott, 23, and Denise Nasland, 19, from Lake Sammamish State Park in broad daylight on the same afternoon, approaching them separately in front of witnesses and using the name Ted while asking for help with his sailboat. Bundy was arrested in Utah in August 1975 after a police officer stopped him for a traffic violation and found suspicious items in his car, including handcuffs, a crowbar, rope, and other items. This led to his identification as a suspect in several disappearances. He was eventually convicted of kidnapping in Utah and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But in 1977, while being held in Colorado to face murder charges there, Bundy engineered a dramatic escape by jumping out of a courthouse window during a court recess. He was recaptured several days later. Then, in December 1977, he escaped again, this time from his jail cell, and made his way to Florida. In Florida, on January 15, 1978, Bundy attacked the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee, committing what would be his most brutal and frenzied attack. He entered the sorority house around 3 a.m. and attacked 4 women in rapid succession. He killed Margaret Bowman, 21, and Lisa Levy, 20, and severely injured 2 other women who survived. The attack was savage and showed a loss of the control that had characterized his earlier crimes. 3 weeks later, on February 9, 1978, he abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, taking her from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida. He was finally captured in Pensacola, Florida, on February 15, 1978, after a police officer recognized him from wanted posters and pulled him over for driving a stolen vehicle. In the car were credit cards belonging to women he'd attacked. His capture came not through brilliant detective work connecting his crimes, but through the luck of an observant officer recognizing him. The trials that followed became media sensations, partly because of Bundy's appearance and demeanor. He acted as his own attorney at times, displaying the intelligence and charm that had allowed him to kill for so long without being caught. He cross-examined witnesses, made legal arguments, and presented himself as a capable lawyer fighting against injustice. The courtroom proceedings were among the first to be televised nationally, and millions watched, fascinated as this handsome, articulate man defended himself against charges of brutal murder. Bundy even proposed to and married Carol Ann Boone, a former co-worker, during his trial, taking advantage of an obscure Florida law that considered a declaration of marriage in court before a judge to be legally binding. Boone would later give birth to a daughter conceived during conjugal visits that shouldn't have been allowed. This demonstrated Bundy's ability to manipulate and charm even while on trial for his life. On July 24, 1979, Bundy was convicted of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death. He was later convicted of murdering Kimberly Leach and received another death sentence. He would spend the next decade on death row, during which time he gave numerous interviews, confessed to murders, and continued to manipulate his image and control his narrative to the extent possible. As his execution date approached, Bundy began confessing to additional murders, providing details to investigators in a final attempt to delay his execution. He confessed to murders in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, giving information that allowed some families to finally learn what had happened to their missing daughters. However, he remained vague or misleading about certain details, and some of his confessions couldn't be fully verified. Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair at Florida State Prison in Rayford on January 24, 1989, at 7:16 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. He was 42 years old. His last words were reportedly directed at his attorney and a minister. "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." Outside the prison, hundreds of onlookers celebrated, some holding signs that read, "Burn, Bundy, burn," and setting off fireworks when his death was announced. It was a macabre carnival atmosphere that reflected the intense public interest in and hatred of this killer who had seemed so normal, so trustworthy, so unlikely. The Bundy case represents a different form of hiding in plain sight than Rader or Gacy, where they maintained relatively ordinary appearances in their communities. Bundy was actively admired. He was good-looking, smart, and seemingly destined for success. He had worked at a suicide hotline, helping people in crisis. He had volunteered for political campaigns. He had attended law school. The gap between what he appeared to be and what he actually was created profound cognitive dissonance for everyone who knew him. Anne Rule, who had worked alongside him at the crisis hotline, struggled to reconcile the friendly, helpful young man she'd known with the brutal killer he was revealed to be. She would write about this struggle in The Stranger Beside Me, describing how long it took her to accept that her friend Ted was capable of such horrific crimes. She would eventually come to see him as a sadistic sociopath who took pleasure from another human's pain and the control he had over his victims to the point of death and even after. Bundy's former girlfriends, including Elizabeth Kendall, described a charming, attentive partner who seemed incapable of violence. Yet Kendall also noted moments when something seemed off, times when Ted's mask slipped slightly, revealing brief glimpses of the predator beneath. She eventually reported him to police as a possible suspect, though her report was initially dismissed because Bundy seemed so unlikely as a killer. The Bundy case taught law enforcement valuable lessons about how intelligent, organized killers can evade capture by maintaining a convincing normal appearance. It also highlighted how physical attractiveness and charm can serve as powerful camouflage, making it harder for both potential victims and investigators to recognize danger. The case contributed to the development of FBI profiling techniques and improved interjurisdictional cooperation in investigating serial crimes. The victims of Ted Bundy deserve to be remembered as individuals with their own stories, not just as victims in a notorious killer's legacy. They were daughters, sisters, students, professionals, each with their own dreams and potential. Linda Ann Healy was a 21-year-old psychology major and radio announcer. Donna Gail Manson, 19, was studying environmental studies. Susan Rancourt, 18, was a biology major. Kathy Parks, 20, was studying at Oregon State University. Brenda Ball, 22, was living independently and working. Georgianne Hawkins, 18, was a popular student at the University of Washington. Denise Nasland, 19, worked as a computer programmer. Janice Ott, 23, worked as a probation caseworker helping troubled youth. These women had families, ambitions, futures that Bundy destroyed. In Utah and Colorado, victims included Nancy Wilcox, 16, Melissa Smith, 17, Laura Aim, 17, Debbie Kent, 17, Karen Campbell, 23, Julie Cunningham, 26, Denise Oliverson, 25, Lynette Culver, 12, and Susan Curtis, 15. In Florida, Margaret Bowman, 21, Lisa Levy, 20, and Kimberly Leach, 12, lost their lives. Each of these women and girls deserved long lives, the opportunity to accomplish their goals, to love and be loved, to contribute to the world. Bundy stole all of that from them, and their memory deserves to be honored. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He would become known as the Green River Killer and would eventually plead guilty to 49 murders, making him one of the most prolific, confirmed serial killers in United States history. Ridgway claimed the number was higher, somewhere between 65 and 80 victims, though the actual count remains unverified, and investigators believe his higher estimates may be exaggerated. What makes Ridgway's case particularly relevant to our discussion is how utterly ordinary he was, how completely he blended into normal working-class life while committing horrific crimes for over 2 decades. Ridgway grew up in what became SeaTac, Washington, near Seattle. His childhood was marked by dysfunction and difficulty. His mother was reportedly domineering and had a volatile relationship with young Gary. He struggled in school, with an IQ measured around 82, placing him in the dull normal range of intelligence. He had difficulty with reading and often felt inadequate compared to his peers. He wet the bed until his teens, which his mother reportedly humiliated him about, making him wash his own sheets, and sometimes punishing him publicly. He graduated from high school with poor grades. He enlisted in the Navy in the late 1960s and served during the Vietnam War period, though he saw no combat. After his military service, Ridgway returned to Washington and began working for the Kenworth Truck Company as a painter in the truck factory. He would hold this job for over 30 years, from 1969 until his arrest in 2001, becoming a long-term, reliable employee. Co-workers described him as quiet, somewhat slow, but dependable. He showed up on time, did his job, and didn't cause trouble. In other words, he was forgettable, exactly the kind of person who could commit murder without drawing suspicion. Ridgway was married 3 times during his killing years. His first marriage to Claudia Barrows lasted from 1970 to 1972. His second marriage to Marcia Brown lasted from 1973 to 1981. His wives knew him as a man with a strong sex drive and some unusual habits, but nothing that clearly suggested he he was a murderer. His second wife, Marcia, would later describe finding unusual items in their home, women's jewelry and clothing that didn't belong to her, but she'd convinced herself there must be innocent explanations. His third wife, Judith Mawson, whom he married in 1988, claimed she had no suspicions until his arrest. Judith would later write a book about her experience, describing a man who seemed devoted to her, who read the Bible with her, who appeared to be a normal husband. She stated that she didn't watch the news and wasn't aware of the Green River Killer case, despite living in the area where it was occurring. When Ridgway was arrested in 2001, Judith was completely shocked, unable to reconcile the man she'd lived with for over a decade with the serial killer he actually was. Ridgway attended church regularly and read the Bible frequently. He would later admit that his religious practices were part of his attempt to control his urges to kill, though they were unsuccessful. He also admitted that he sometimes cried after killing because he knew what he was doing was wrong, yet he couldn't stop himself. This admission, however, should be viewed skeptically. Many serial killers claim remorse or lack of control when it serves their interests. Ridgway targeted sex workers and vulnerable young women, many of them runaways or those struggling with addiction. He would pick them up along the Pacific Highway South, also known as the SeaTac Strip, an area known for prostitution, near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Ridgway claimed that he targeted sex workers because, in his words, he both desired and despised them. He stated that he knew they would be easy victims because they got into cars with strangers. They might not be immediately reported missing, and their cases might not be investigated as vigorously as other missing persons. Experts note this explanation is self-serving and designed to make his crimes seem calculated rather than revealing any genuine emotional complexity. His method was brutally simple and consistent. He would pick up women, often engaging their services as a prostitute, take them to secluded areas, sometimes his home, his truck, or wooded locations, and kill them, usually through strangulation. He preferred to use his hands or a ligature, maintaining physical contact and control throughout the murder. After killing them, he would dispose of their bodies in wooded areas around King County, often in clusters, returning later to have sex with the decomposing remains. The desecration of his victims' bodies revealed the depth of his depravity and his need for control that extended even beyond death. The first victims attributed to the Green River Killer were found in 1982. Between July and August of that year, 5 bodies were discovered in or near the Green River in King County, Washington, giving the killer his nickname. The bodies of Wendy Lee Caulfield, 16, Deborah Lynn Bonner, 23, Marsha Faye Chapman, 31, Opal Charmaine Mills, 16, and Cynthia Jean Hines, 17, were all found in the river or on its banks during this period. Over the next several years, more bodies were discovered in wooded areas around Seattle, and the body count continued to rise. Clusters of remains were found in areas like Star Lake, the SeaTac Airport vicinity, and along Highway 18 and Interstate 90. The pattern suggested a single killer who was very familiar with the area and was methodically disposing of bodies in locations where they would be found eventually, but not immediately. The Green River Task Force was established in 1984 to investigate the killings. At its peak, it was one of the largest serial killer investigations in American history, with dozens of detectives working full-time on the case. They interviewed thousands of suspects, including Gary Ridgway. Ridgway first came to police attention in 1982 when he was stopped by police while he was in his truck with a sex worker. This was noted but didn't lead to arrest. In 1983, the boyfriend of victim Marie Malvar followed a truck he believed had picked her up to a house in Des Moines, Washington, Ridgway's house. Police questioned Ridgway, but he denied involvement. In 1984, investigators gave Ridgway a polygraph test regarding the murders. He passed the test, and investigators moved on to other suspects. This false negative on the polygraph test would prove to be a critical error that allowed Ridgway to continue killing for years. In 1987, investigators collected a saliva sample from Ridgway as part of their investigation, but DNA technology at the time wasn't advanced enough to make use of it effectively. The sample sat in evidence for years while Ridgway continued to kill. Ridgway's killing slowed significantly after he married his third wife, Judith, in 1988. He would later claim that he truly loved Judith and that his marriage to her reduced his violent urges. Of his 49 confirmed victims, only 3 were killed after his marriage to Judith. Whether this was due to emotional factors, increased difficulty in hiding his activities from a spouse, or simply the natural progression of his aging and declining drive, remains unclear. By the late 1990s, the Green River killings had apparently stopped. The task force was reduced in size. The case went cold. But advances in DNA technology would eventually break it open. In 2001, Detective Dave Reichert, who had been involved in the Green River case since the beginning and had risen to become Sheriff of King County, ordered a review of old evidence using new DNA techniques. They tested the saliva sample taken from Ridgway in 1987 against DNA collected from 4 of the earliest Green River Killer victims: Opal Mills, Marsha Chapman, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Christensen. The DNA was a match. On November 30th, 2001, Gary Ridgway was arrested at his workplace at Kenworth Truck Company, where he'd worked for over 30 years. Co-workers were shocked. This quiet, unremarkable man they'd worked alongside for decades was the Green River Killer? It seemed impossible. Ridgway had always been so normal, so ordinary, so forgettable. During interrogation, faced with overwhelming DNA evidence, Ridgway began to confess. Over several months of interviews with investigators, he would eventually provide detailed information about 48 murders. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, Ridgway agreed to plead guilty to all murders for which he could provide verifiable information and to help investigators locate remaining victims and bring closure to families. The confession tapes are chilling in their matter-of-fact tone. Ridgway spoke about his victims as though they were objects. He said things like, "I killed so many women, I have a hard time keeping them straight," and admitted he didn't even know most of their names. He said, "Most of the time, I killed them the first time I met them, and I do not have a good memory for their faces." He explained his targeting of sex workers by saying, "I picked prostitutes because I thought I could kill as many of them as I wanted without getting caught." On December 18th, 2003, Gary Ridgway was sentenced to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In 2011, he pleaded guilty to a 49th murder after remains were identified as belonging to Rebecca Marrero, whom he'd killed in 1982. He received another life sentence. Recent developments in the case have continued to bring closure to families. In December 2023, authorities confirmed that remains found in 1985 and known as Bones 17 belonged to 15-year-old Lori Ann Razpotnik, who had run away from home in 1982. In January 2024, authorities confirmed that the last remaining unidentified set of remains linked to Ridgway belonged to 16-year-old Tammy Lyles, whose partial remains had been identified as early as 1988, but whose full identification took decades. In March 2025, court documents revealed that Ridgway was briefly transferred from Washington State Penitentiary to King County Jail in September 2024 to assist investigators in locating additional remains. Authorities have not disclosed whether this effort was successful, stating only that involved cases remain open. Ridgway currently resides at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, where he will remain for the rest of his life. He is now 76 years old and in failing health. The Ridgway case illustrates how a killer who is completely unremarkable, even somewhat slow and unimpressive, can successfully evade capture for decades. Ridgway wasn't charming like Bundy. He wasn't active in his community like Gacy or Rader. He was simply ordinary to the point of being forgettable. He went to work, came home, lived a quiet life. And that ordinariness was itself a form of camouflage that allowed him to kill at least 49 women over 2 decades. His wives struggled with profound questions after his arrest. Judith Ridgway described the cognitive dissonance of reconciling the man she'd shared her life with, the man she'd trusted, slept beside, read the Bible with, and the Green River Killer. She described how he would sometimes leave early for work, ostensibly for overtime pay, but now she wonders if those were the mornings he was killing. The betrayal and horror of such realizations are difficult to comprehend. The victims of Gary Ridgway were women whose lives had value, who deserved safety and dignity. Many were struggling with addiction or poverty, engaged in sex work to survive. Their vulnerability didn't make their lives less valuable. It made their murders all the more tragic because they were already in difficult circumstances and deserved help, not violence. Wendy Lee Caulfield was 16 years old, a runaway who could have been helped, who could have gotten her life back on track. Giselle Lovvorn was 19. Deborah Bonner was 23. Marsha Chapman was 31 and a mother. These women had families who loved them, who reported them missing, who never stopped looking for them. Many of Ridgway's victims were teenagers. Opal Mills, 16, Cynthia Hines, 17, Terry Milligan, 16, Alma Smith, 18, Dolores Williams, 17, Gail Matthews, 23. They were young women with their whole lives ahead of them. Tammy Lyles, whose remains were the last to be identified, was 16 years old when Ridgway killed her. Lori Ann Respotnik was just 15. These were children who needed protection, who instead encountered a predator. The full list of Ridgway's confirmed victims represents a staggering loss of life, each person an individual with their own story. Wendy Lee Caulfield, Giselle Lovvorn, Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marsha Faye Chapman, Opal Charmaine Mills, Cynthia Jean Hines, Terry Renee Milligan, Mary Bridget Meehan, Deborah Estes, Linda Jane Rule, Denise Darcel Bush, Shonda Leah Summers, Shirley Marie Sherrill, Rebecca Marrero, Colleen Renee Brockman, Alma Ann Smith, Dolores Laverne Williams, Gail Lynn Matthews, Andrea M. Childers, Sandra K. Gabbett, Kimmy Kai Pitsaw, Marie M. Malvar, Carol Ann Christensen, Martina Teresa Ortherly, Cheryl Lee Wims, Yvonne Antosh, Carrie Ann Royce, Constance Elizabeth Nayon, Kelly Marie Ware, Tina Marie Thompson, April Dawn Buttram, Debbie Mae Abernathy, Tracy Ann Winston, Maureen Sue Feeney, Mary Sue Bello, Pammy Annette Avant, Delise Louise Plager, Kimberly L. Nelson, Lisa Yates, Mary Exeter West, Cindy Ann Smith, Patricia Michelle Barksack, Roberta Joseph Hayes, Marta Reeves, Patricia Ann Yellow Robe, Tammy Lyles, Laurie Ann Raspotnik, and 2 victims who remain unidentified. Each of these women's lives mattered. They were daughters, sisters, some were mothers. Their humanity must be remembered. Israel Keyes, the methodical predator. If the previous cases represent killers who maintained normal appearances in specific communities, Israel Keyes represents something even more chilling. A killer who meticulously planned to be nearly impossible to catch, who had no consistent victim type, no geographic focus, no discernible pattern. Keyes was perhaps the most methodical and calculating serial killer of the modern era, and he successfully hid in plain sight by ensuring that no one could connect his crimes to him or to each other. Israel Keyes was born on January 7, 1978, in Richmond, Utah. Some sources say Cove, Utah, the second of 10 children born to Heidi Hackinson and John Jeffrey Keyes. His family moved frequently during his childhood, living in various locations before eventually settling in the isolated area of Colville, Washington, in a remote cabin with no electricity or running water. The family was deeply religious, adhering to fundamentalist Christian beliefs associated with the Christian identity movement, and the children were homeschooled in isolation from mainstream society. As a teenager, Keyes exhibited disturbing behavior that should have been warning signs. He was known to be cruel to animals, killing and torturing creatures he found in the woods. He broke into neighbors' homes, stealing items, and sometimes vandalizing property. But these behaviors didn't result in serious legal consequences or intervention that might have prevented his later crimes. By his late teens, Keyes had rejected his family's religious beliefs and declared himself an atheist, causing a significant rift with his family. This rejection of their ideology seemed to remove what little moral framework he might have had. In July 1998, at age 20, Keyes enlisted in the United States Army. He served from 1998 to 2001, including time stationed in Egypt and at Fort Lewis in Washington state. His military service was unremarkable. He achieved the rank of specialist and received an honorable discharge. Nothing about his military record suggested the darkness that lay beneath. His service gave him training, discipline, and experience that he would later apply to his crimes. After leaving the military, Keyes moved around the United States before eventually settling in Alaska in 2007. He had a daughter with a girlfriend, and by all accounts, he was a devoted father who loved his child deeply. This genuine love for his daughter seems to have been one of the few authentic emotions Keyes experienced, and he would later express concern about how his crimes would affect her. Keyes worked as a handyman and contractor, eventually starting his own business, Keyes Construction, in Alaska. He was reliable, skilled, and professional. Clients trusted him with keys to their homes, with access to their properties while they were away, with intimate details of their lives and security systems. He seemed like exactly the kind of honest, hard-working contractor everyone hopes to find. But during this same period, Israel Keyes was committing murders, bank robberies, arsons, burglaries, and other crimes across the United States, and he was doing so in a way specifically designed to prevent law enforcement from ever connecting the dots or identifying him as the perpetrator. Keyes had studied other serial killers extensively. He read about famous cases, understood how they'd been caught, and learned from their mistakes. He understood the methods law enforcement used to track and profile serial offenders, and he structured his crimes specifically to defeat those methods. Most serial killers have patterns that eventually lead to their capture. They target a specific type of victim. They operate in a specific geographic area. They use consistent methods. These patterns allow investigators to identify connections between crimes and eventually track down the perpetrator through geographical profiling, victim pattern analysis, and other investigative techniques. Keyes deliberately avoided all patterns. He had no consistent victim type. He killed both men and women of various ages and backgrounds. He didn't operate in any specific geographic region. He traveled thousands of miles between crimes, flying to different parts of the country to commit murders far from where he lived. He used different methods for different murders. He was specifically trying to be unprofilable, untrackable, impossible to catch through traditional investigative methods. His planning was meticulous and demonstrated extremely long-term thinking. Years before committing murders, Keyes would travel to different parts of the country and bury kill kits in remote locations. These kits contained weapons, tools, restraints, cash, and other items he might need to commit crimes. He would carefully document the locations and later retrieve the kits when he was ready to kill. This meant he could fly to a region where he had a kill kit buried, rent a car using cash and possibly fake identification, drive to a random location, select a victim he'd never seen before, commit the crime using tools that couldn't be traced to him, and then disappear back to Alaska. The crime would appear to be a local murder, with no connection to anyone outside the immediate area. Keyes funded these activities through bank robberies, which he committed with the same calculated approach, traveling far from home, targeting small banks with poor security, taking enough money to fund his activities, but not enough to trigger major federal investigations. Investigators believe Keyes killed at least 8 people, though he hinted at more, and the actual number remains unknown. His confirmed victims include Bill and Lorraine Currier of Vermont, whom he murdered in June 2011, and Samantha Koenig of Alaska, whom he abducted and killed in February 2012. The Currier murder demonstrates Keyes' methodology perfectly. In 2009, 2 years before the murder, Keyes traveled to Vermont and buried a kill kit in the woods near Essex. In June 2011, he flew to Chicago, rented a car, and drove to Vermont. He retrieved his kill kit, which contained a gun and other tools. He then spent time scouting the area and identified the Currier's home. On the night of June 8, 2011, he broke into their home, tied up Bill Currier, age 50, and Lorraine Currier, age 55, forced them into their own vehicle and drove them to an abandoned farmhouse he'd scouted in advance. There, he shot Bill, sexually assaulted and strangled Lorraine, and then dismembered their bodies, disposing of the remains in different locations where they have never been found. Keyes then drove back to Chicago, returned his rental car, flew home to Alaska, and resumed his normal life. To investigators in Vermont, this appeared to be a local crime with no obvious suspect. Keyes was a devoted father to his young daughter. His girlfriend and her family had no idea about his crimes. His clients in Alaska trusted him completely, hired him for jobs, recommended him to friends. He maintained his contracting business successfully while secretly flying around the country to commit murders. He was hiding in plain sight by being extremely ordinary in his local community while committing horrors far away where no one would connect them to him. But Keyes made a critical error with his final victim. On February 1, 2012, he impulsively abducted 18-year-old Samantha Koenig from the Common Grounds espresso stand where she worked in Anchorage. This was highly unusual for Keyes. He typically traveled far from home to commit crimes and planned them meticulously rather than acting impulsively. But on this night, he kidnapped Samantha, took her to his house, where he sexually assaulted and killed her, and then left her body in a shed on his property while he went on a pre-planned 2-week cruise with his daughter and girlfriend. After returning from the cruise, Keyes retrieved Samantha's body, which had been frozen by Alaska's winter temperatures. In a particularly disturbing act, he applied makeup to her face and sewed her eyes open with fishing line to make her appear alive, then took a photograph of her holding a recent newspaper. He sent this photo to her family along with a ransom demand, hoping to make them believe she was still alive and being held for ransom. He then dismembered her body and disposed of it in Matanuska Lake, north of Anchorage. Keyes began withdrawing money from Samantha's stolen bank account as he traveled through the southwestern United States. This left a digital trail. ATM cameras captured images of his rental car in various locations, and police were able to track his movements. On March 13, 2012, Texas Highway Patrol Corporal Brian Henry pulled over Keyes in the parking lot of the Cotton Patch Cafe in Lufkin, Texas. A search of his vehicle revealed evidence linking him to Samantha's abduction, including her debit card. During interrogation, Keyes was cooperative but calculated in what he revealed. He confessed to the Koenig and Currier murders in detail, providing information that allowed investigators to verify his involvement. But he remained vague about other crimes, hinting at additional victims but not providing specific details. He seemed to enjoy controlling the flow of information, keeping investigators guessing about the full extent of his crimes. Keyes expressed genuine concern about his daughter, stating he didn't want her to grow up knowing about his crimes or suffering because of his actions. He said, "I want my kid to have a chance to grow up. You know, she's in a safe place now. She's not going to see any of this. I want her to have a chance to grow up and not have all this hanging over her head." This concern for his daughter appears to have been authentic, one of the few genuine emotions investigators observed in him. On December 2, 2012, while being held in the Anchorage Correctional Complex awaiting trial, Israel Keyes committed suicide. Despite being on suicide watch, he managed to use a razor blade to cut his wrist and then strangled himself with a bedsheet. He left behind a 4-page suicide note written in verse that reflected on his crimes and American society, but provided no specific information about other victims. His death brought an abrupt end to the case and left many questions unanswered about the full extent of his killing spree. Keyes' death left law enforcement with more questions than answers. How many people did he actually kill? Where are the other victims? What other crimes did he commit? Investigators continue to work on cases that might be connected to Keyes, but without his cooperation, many of these cases may remain unsolved. The Keyes case represents a new kind of challenge for law enforcement. He wasn't a killer who could be caught through traditional profiling or pattern recognition because he specifically structured his crimes to avoid patterns. He deliberately traveled thousands of miles between crimes, selected random victims, used buried weapons that couldn't be traced, and maintained a completely normal life in his home community. He hid in plain sight, not by being a beloved community figure or a church leader, but by being so methodical and calculated that his crimes couldn't be connected to him. For the people who knew Keyes, his girlfriend, his daughter, his clients, his neighbors, the revelation of his crimes was devastating. He'd seemed like a good father, a skilled worker, a quiet but friendly member of the community. The gap between who he appeared to be and what he actually was represents one of the most extreme examples of successful deception. The confirmed victims of Israel Keyes, Bill Currier, age 50, an engineer; Lorraine Currier, age 55, a registered nurse; and Samantha Koenig, age 18, a young woman just starting her adult life, represent just a fraction of the lives he may have destroyed. Bill and Lorraine were a couple who'd been married for years, living their normal lives in Vermont. Their disappearance was initially treated as a possible voluntary departure, and it took years before their case was connected to Keyes. Samantha Koenig was working at a coffee stand to save money, making plans for her future. Her abduction and murder galvanized the community and led to intense media coverage that ultimately contributed to Keyes' capture. There are likely other families who don't know that their missing loved ones were victims of Israel Keyes. He hinted at murders in various states, mentioned burying victims in remote locations, and suggested his kill count was higher than the confirmed cases. Some families may never get answers or closure. Keyes' ability to hide his crimes through methodical planning and geographic dispersal represents a nightmare scenario for law enforcement. A killer who specifically studies how to avoid detection and implements those strategies with military precision and complete lack of remorse. The science behind the mask. Understanding how these killers successfully hid in plain sight requires examining the intersection of psychology, neuroscience, and social dynamics. Researchers have made significant progress in understanding the mechanisms that allow such extreme deception. From a neurological perspective, studies using brain imaging technology have revealed differences in the brains of individuals with psychopathic traits compared to normal populations. The amygdala, which processes emotions like fear and empathy, often shows reduced activity in individuals with psychopathic personality disorder. The prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control, decision-making, and planning, may show unusual patterns of activation. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex, associated with moral reasoning and emotional regulation, may function differently. Research published in journals like the Archives of General Psychiatry has shown that psychopathic individuals may process emotional information differently at a neural level. When shown images designed to elicit empathic responses, such as people in pain, their brains don't show the same activation patterns as non-psychopathic individuals. This suggests that their lack of empathy isn't just a choice or character flaw, but may have a biological component. However, experts emphasize that brain differences don't excuse behavior or remove responsibility. Many people with neurological variations never commit crimes. The brain differences may create predispositions or make certain behaviors easier, but choices and actions remain the individual's responsibility. Furthermore, not all violent criminals show these brain differences, and not all people with these brain differences become violent. From a psychological standpoint, the concept of compartmentalization is central to understanding how killers maintain their facades. Compartmentalization is a defense mechanism where contradictory thoughts, feelings, or activities are kept separate to avoid psychological discomfort. Clinical psychologists note that everyone uses compartmentalization to some degree. We might keep work stress separate from family time, for instance. But for serial killers like Rader, Gacy, Bundy, Ridgway, and Keyes, compartmentalization becomes extreme. Forensic psychologists describe this as creating entirely separate psychological spaces for their murderous activities and their normal lives. Dennis Rader called this cubing, his own terminology for maintaining separate compartments for church Dennis, work Dennis, family Dennis, and killer Dennis. Some research has suggested this extreme compartmentalization may be related to dissociation, a psychological process where aspects of identity, memory, or consciousness become disconnected. However, forensic psychologists emphasize that serial killers are generally not experiencing true dissociative disorders like dissociative identity disorder, formerly called multiple personality disorder. They're consciously choosing to engage in violence and consciously working to hide it. The compartmentalization is a tool they use, not a mental illness that excuses their behavior. The social psychological aspect is equally important in understanding how these killers succeed. Research in social cognition has shown that we use mental shortcuts called heuristics to make quick judgments about people. Does someone dress appropriately? Do they have a job? Do they participate in community activities? Do they smile and make eye contact? These heuristics usually serve us well, allowing us to navigate social situations efficiently without conducting background checks on everyone we meet. But skilled manipulators can exploit these heuristics by presenting the right surface indicators, appropriate dress, stable employment, community involvement, friendly demeanor. They trigger our mental shortcuts that categorize them as safe and trustworthy. This is why Rader's position as a church president, Gacy's work as a clown, and Bundy's law student status were such effective cover. These roles come with built-in assumptions of trustworthiness. Research has also identified the fundamental attribution error, our tendency to attribute others' behavior to their character while attributing our own behavior to circumstances. When we see someone being helpful or kind, we tend to think, that's a good person, rather than, that person is behaving helpfully in this moment. This makes it difficult for us to believe that someone who consistently acts friendly could be capable of violence. The just world hypothesis, our desire to believe the world is fair and orderly, also plays a role. We want to believe that bad things happen to people who somehow deserve them, and that good things happen to good people. This makes it psychologically difficult to accept that your neighbor, who helps with yard work and attends church, could be a murderer. Our brains resist information that contradicts our need for an orderly, predictable world. Research in social psychology has also shown that authority and social roles create additional cover for predators. Studies like the famous Stanford Prison Experiment and Milgram obedience experiments demonstrated how powerfully social roles can influence behavior and perception. When someone is in a position of authority or respect, a church leader, a businessman, a volunteer, we're less likely to question their behavior or motives, even when warning signs are present. The phenomenon of cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we experience when confronted with contradictory information, helps explain why people close to these killers often struggled to accept the truth, even when evidence mounted. The contradiction between my neighbor is a friendly person and my neighbor is a serial killer creates such intense psychological discomfort that people's brains may resist accepting the new information, instead finding ways to explain it away or minimize it. Research into criminal profiling has evolved significantly in response to cases like these. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, established in the 1970s, pioneered the use of psychological profiling to investigate serial crimes. Early profiling divided killers into organized and disorganized types, with organized killers being those who plan carefully, maintain control, and often lead normal-appearing lives, like the killers we've discussed. Modern profiling recognizes greater complexity and diversity in how serial offenders operate. Research published in journals like the Journal of Forensic Sciences has refined our understanding of different offender types, motivational structures, and behavioral patterns. Investigators now recognize that there's no single serial killer type and that skilled offenders will deliberately structure their behavior to avoid fitting expected patterns, as Israel Keyes did. Forensic psychology has also advanced in understanding the motivation structures of serial killers. While popular culture often focuses on sexual motivations, research suggests that power, control, and domination are more central to many serial killers' psychology than sexual gratification per se. The sexual component, when present, is often more about exerting power than about desire or pleasure. The FBI's creation of the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, in 1985 was a direct response to cases of killers who operated across jurisdictions. VICAP is a database that allows law enforcement agencies to enter information about violent crimes and search for patterns that might connect cases across different locations. This system might have caught someone like Israel Keyes earlier by connecting seemingly unrelated murders across state lines. Advances in forensic science have dramatically improved law enforcement's ability to investigate and solve these crimes. DNA technology has been revolutionary. Gary Ridgway was caught because DNA techniques that didn't exist when he first came under suspicion in the 1980s were able to match his DNA to evidence from victims in 2001. Similarly, DNA evidence has been used to solve cold cases and connect crimes that seemed unrelated. Digital forensics has become equally important. Dennis Rader was caught partly because metadata on a floppy disk led investigators to him. Modern killers leave digital footprints through cell phone records, internet searches, GPS data, ATM cameras, and countless other sources that didn't exist for earlier generations of offenders. However, significant challenges remain in detecting and stopping serial killers who successfully hide in plain sight. The balance between civil liberties and public safety is delicate. We can't investigate everyone who seems slightly unusual or intrude into private lives without cause. The freedoms that make democratic society possible also create spaces where predators can operate. Resource limitations affect investigation quality. Many law enforcement agencies, particularly in smaller jurisdictions, lack the resources to conduct extensive investigations of every suspicious circumstance. This means some warning signs may not be pursued as thoroughly as they should be. The need for better communication and cooperation between jurisdictions remains crucial. Israel Keyes specifically exploited the fact that law enforcement agencies in different states often don't communicate effectively about crimes. Breaking down these barriers, sharing information more readily, and looking for connections across geographic boundaries are essential for catching mobile offenders. Understanding these scientific and social mechanisms isn't just academically interesting, it has practical implications for public safety, investigation techniques, and community awareness. The more we understand about how these killers operate and how they successfully deceive others, the better equipped we are to recognize warning signs and prevent future tragedies. The impact on communities and families. The revelation that a serial killer has been living among them has profound and lasting effects on communities and families that extend far beyond the immediate circle of victims. The psychological trauma ripples outward, touching everyone who had contact with the killer or who lives in the affected community. For family members of the killers themselves, the discovery creates a unique and devastating form of trauma. They must simultaneously grieve the loss of the person they thought they knew while grappling with the horror of who that person actually was. Dennis Rader's wife Paula and their children Kerry and Brian had to face an impossible reality. The husband and father they'd known for decades was BTK. Paula immediately filed for an emergency divorce on July 26, 2005, waiving the normal 60-day waiting period. She released a statement saying that neither she nor her children had any suspicion of his crimes. But the legal dissolution of marriage couldn't erase 34 years of shared life or the questions that haunted her. Had she missed signs? Could she have done something? How could the man who'd been her partner, who'd raised their children, who'd shared her bed, be capable of such horrors? Their daughter, Kerry Rawson, has been the most public of Rader's family members in addressing the trauma. In her 2019 book, A Serial Killer's Daughter, My Story of Faith, Love, and Overcoming. And in the 2025 Netflix documentary, My Father, the BTK Killer, she shared her journey of trying to reconcile the father she remembered, who attended her school events, who taught her to drive, who walked her down the aisle at her wedding with the serial killer he actually was. Kerry described the moment of his arrest. She was at work when FBI agents came to tell her that her father had been arrested for the BTK murders. Her first reaction was disbelief, then anger, then a profound sense of betrayal. She wrote about the agonizing process of going through childhood memories, analyzing every moment for signs she'd missed. She described the guilt she felt, wondering if she could have somehow stopped him if she'd been more perceptive. In letters Rader wrote to Kerry from prison, he showed a disturbing mix of apparent fatherly affection and complete lack of genuine remorse. He wrote things like, "You will always be my baby girl I raised right," and referred to his crimes as the dark side that took me away, as if his murders were something that happened to him rather than choices he made. Kerry eventually stopped responding to most of his letters, recognizing that his apparent emotions were more about his own needs than genuine concern for her well-being. The Rader children have largely stayed out of public life, attempting to build identities separate from their father's crimes. But the name Rader is forever associated with BTK in Wichita and beyond, making anonymity difficult. John Wayne Gacy's family experienced similar trauma. His ex-wife, Carol Hoff, discovered that the man she'd been married to, the man who'd been stepfather to her daughters, had been murdering young men and burying them under the house where her family had lived. She expressed profound relief that her daughters hadn't been harmed, but struggled with questions about how she'd missed the signs. She'd noticed strange smells, unusual behavior, evidence that something was wrong, but she'd never imagined murder. Gacy's mother and sister also struggled to reconcile the family member they'd known with the killer revealed in court. His mother maintained until her death that she believed there was some mistake, that the John she knew couldn't have done these things. This denial, while psychologically understandable, prevented her from fully accepting reality. Ted Bundy's long-term girlfriend, Elizabeth Kendall, wrote about her experience in The Phantom Prince, My Life with Ted Bundy. She described the slow, horrifying realization that the man she loved, the man she'd considered marrying, might be responsible for the murders she'd been reading about in the newspapers. She'd even reported him to police at one point. but his charm and the cognitive dissonance of suspecting someone so seemingly normal had made her doubt her own instincts. After his execution, she expressed relief that he could never hurt anyone again, but also grief for the person she'd thought he was. Bundy's ex-wife, Carol Ann Boone, whom he married during his trial, maintained his innocence for years, even after his conviction. She divorced him in 1986, several years before his execution, after finally accepting that he was guilty. She and their daughter subsequently disappeared from public life, presumably to escape the association with his crimes. For Gary Ridgway's third wife, Judith Mawson, the revelation came completely out of nowhere. She'd been married to him for over a decade and later wrote that she had no suspicions whatsoever. In her book, Green River, Running Red, she described her shock and horror at his arrest. She'd known Gary as a devoted husband who read the Bible with her, who seemed to care deeply about their relationship. The discovery that he was the Green River Killer shattered her understanding of reality. Judith described analyzing every moment of their marriage, looking for clues she'd missed. She realized that his sometimes early departures for work, which he'd explained as overtime, might have been when he was killing. She remembered times when he'd come home late or seemed distracted, behaviors she'd attributed to work stress, but which now took on sinister new meanings. Israel Keys's girlfriend faced unique trauma. Not only had the father of her child been a serial killer, but their daughter was young enough that she would grow up with this knowledge. How do you explain to a child that their father, who by all accounts loved them genuinely, was also a methodical murderer? How do you help them process that duality? Keys's girlfriend has remained completely out of public view, presumably to protect their daughter's privacy and give her a chance at a normal life. The broader communities affected by these killers also struggled profoundly. Wichita, Kansas, lived under the shadow of BTK for 30 years. Every unsolved murder, every unexplained death was potentially connected to BTK. Parents warned children to be careful. Women lived in fear. The community was traumatized by the unknown killer in their midst. When Dennis Rader was revealed as BTK, the response was complex. There was relief that the killer had been caught and would face justice. But there was also a disturbing realization. The killer hadn't been some mysterious figure operating from shadows. He'd been right there all along, writing parking tickets, measuring grass, sitting in church pews, volunteering with Boy Scouts. The predator had been hiding in plain sight in a way that made everyone question their judgment and their safety. The Norwood Park neighborhood in Chicago, where John Wayne Gacy lived, was traumatized by the discovery of 29 bodies buried under his house. The excavation became a media spectacle, with news crews broadcasting images of investigators removing remains. Neighbors gathered behind police tape, trying to process how such horror had existed right next door to them. Many neighbors reported feeling guilt. They'd socialized with Gacy, attended his parties, sent their children to events where he performed as Pogo the Clown. Some had noticed strange smells or odd behaviors but hadn't thought to report them. The question, "How could I not have known?" haunted many residents for years. For families of Gacy's victims, the trial was particularly traumatic. They had to sit through detailed descriptions of how their loved ones had died, presented in a courtroom setting that felt clinical and detached. They had to watch Gacy, who showed no genuine remorse and even seemed to enjoy the attention. The legal process, while necessary for justice, felt like it gave the killer exactly what he wanted: notoriety and an audience. Many of Gacy's victims had been dismissed by authorities as runaways before their connection to Gacy was discovered. Their families had reported them missing, but the cases hadn't been investigated as vigorously as they might have been if the victims had come from different backgrounds. This added another layer of pain, the feeling that society hadn't valued their loved ones' lives enough to search for them properly. The families of Ted Bundy's victims dealt with unique challenges because of Bundy's celebrity status. The trials were televised, making the proceedings public entertainment. Bundy's good looks and charm meant that some people, shockingly, became fans, writing to him in prison, attending his trials to support him. This Bundy groupies phenomenon was deeply disturbing to victims' families who had to watch people romanticize the man who'd killed their daughters and sisters. For Gary Ridgway's victims' families, many dealt with the additional pain of societal stigma. Because many of Ridgway's victims were sex workers or women struggling with addiction, some people, including some law enforcement officers, didn't prioritize their cases as they should have. Families reported feeling that their loved ones weren't considered worthy victims, that their cases were treated as less important. This added to their grief and rage. The identification of victims decades after their deaths brought closure to some families, but also reopened old wounds. When remains found in 1985 were finally identified in 2023 as Lori Ann Razpotnik, her family finally knew what had happened to her, but they also had to grieve all over again, confronting the reality of how she died after decades of not knowing. For Israel Keys's victims' families, the fact that he committed suicide before revealing the full extent of his crimes left them with painful questions that may never be answered. Bill and Lorraine Currier's family had to grapple with the fact that their bodies were never found, denying them even the closure of proper burial. Keys hinted at other victims but never provided enough information for investigators to identify them or locate remains. Victims' families often describe feeling that they're expected to move on, to find closure, to heal, but that's not always possible. The loss of a loved one to murder is traumatic enough. But when that murder was committed by someone who was hiding in plain sight, someone who seemed normal and trustworthy, it adds another layer of psychological complexity that makes healing even more difficult. Some families have channeled their trauma into advocacy. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the National Organization for Victim Assistance, and various state-level victims' rights groups have been founded or supported by families of murder victims. These organizations work to improve how missing persons cases are investigated, push for changes in how law enforcement handles serial crime investigations, advocate for victims' rights in the legal system, and provide support for other families going through similar traumas. But not all families can find purpose in their pain. For some, the trauma is simply overwhelming, the loss too great to build anything from. They cope as best they can, day by day, carrying grief that will never fully heal. There's no right way to respond to such trauma, and families shouldn't be judged for how they handle an impossible situation. Therapists who work with families of serial killer victims describe unique challenges in these cases. The randomness of victimization, the fact that these people were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, makes it harder to find meaning or explanation. There's no reason that can make sense of why this happened. The discovery that the killer was someone who seemed normal, who was hiding in plain sight, undermines basic assumptions about safety and security that therapy often relies on to help trauma survivors rebuild their lives. If you can't trust your ability to identify dangerous people, how do you feel safe in the world? This is a question that many survivors and family members struggle with for years or even the rest of their lives. Communities do eventually recover, though they're changed by the experience. Wichita moved forward after BTK's capture, though the city will always be associated with Dennis Rader. The northwest Chicago suburbs healed after Gacy's execution, though the neighborhood where he lived carries that history. The Seattle area has processed the Green River Killer case, though families are still finding answers decades later. But these places and these families carry scars. The names Rader, Gacy, Bundy, Ridgway, and Keys remain burned into collective memories as reminders that predators can wear friendly faces, live in normal houses, and participate in community life while secretly destroying lives. Lessons and modern detection. The cases we've examined force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and social dynamics, but they also provide insights that experts believe can help prevent future tragedies. Law enforcement, psychology, and forensic science have all evolved in response to these killers, developing better tools for detection and investigation. Perhaps the most important lesson is that surface appearances are fundamentally unreliable indicators of danger. Community involvement, religious devotion, professional success, charm, intelligence, physical attractiveness, none of these protect against predatory behavior. In fact, research suggests that sophisticated predators deliberately cultivate these traits precisely because they know we use them as mental shortcuts for assessing trustworthiness. This means we need to be more willing to question surface impressions and take seriously warning signs even when they come from seemingly unlikely sources. When sex workers reported violence by Gary Ridgway in the 1980s, some investigators dismissed their reports as less credible because of the victim's profession. This bias, the assumption that reports from marginalized people are less trustworthy, allowed Ridgway to continue killing for years. Better training in recognizing and setting aside social biases is crucial for law enforcement. The importance of believing victims and taking all reports seriously cannot be overstated. Many serial killers have early victims who reported assaults or suspicious behavior, but these reports were dismissed or not investigated thoroughly. In Gacy's case, young men reported being attacked or threatened by him, but often these reports weren't taken seriously because of the victims' backgrounds or because Gacy seemed like an upstanding citizen. If even one of these reports had been investigated more thoroughly and believed, how many lives might have been saved? Modern forensic science has dramatically improved law enforcement's ability to investigate and solve these crimes. DNA technology was crucial in finally catching Gary Ridgway after nearly 2 decades. The saliva sample collected from him in 1987 couldn't be effectively analyzed with the technology available at the time, but when new DNA testing methods were developed and applied in 2001, the evidence conclusively linked him to multiple victims. DNA databases like CODIS, Combined DNA Index System, allow investigators to compare DNA evidence from crime scenes to samples from convicted offenders and arrestees. This has solved countless cold cases and linked crimes that seemed unrelated. The technology continues to advance, with forensic genealogy using consumer DNA databases to identify suspects through family connections, becoming a powerful new tool. Digital forensics has become equally important in modern investigations. Dennis Rader was caught partly because metadata on a floppy disk he sent to media led investigators directly to him. Today's killers leave extensive digital footprints through cell phone records, internet searches, GPS data, social media activity, ATM cameras, traffic cameras, and countless other sources that didn't exist for earlier generations of offenders. The development of VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, by the FBI in 1985 represented a crucial step forward in coordinating investigations across jurisdictions. VICAP is a database that allows law enforcement agencies to enter information about violent crimes and search for patterns that might connect cases across different locations. This system might have caught someone like Israel Keys earlier by connecting seemingly unrelated murders across state lines. However, VICAP relies on agencies voluntarily entering data, and not all jurisdictions participate fully. Improving interagency communication and data sharing remains an ongoing challenge. Different agencies use different systems, have different protocols, and sometimes compete rather than cooperate. Breaking down these barriers is essential for catching offenders who cross jurisdictional boundaries. Criminal profiling has evolved significantly since its early days. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, formerly the Behavioral Science Unit, continues to refine profiling techniques based on research and experience. Modern profilers understand that there's no single serial killer type, and that skilled offenders will deliberately structure their behavior to avoid fitting expected patterns. Geographic profiling, analyzing the spatial patterns of crime scenes to identify likely offender locations, has become a valuable tool. Research has shown that serial offenders often commit crimes in areas they're familiar with, and their crime locations often cluster around their home or workplace in predictable ways. Software programs can analyze crime scene locations and generate probability maps of where the offender likely lives or works. Experts emphasize that community awareness and education play important roles in prevention and early detection, teaching people about manipulation tactics, about how predators operate, about the fact that dangerous people don't always look dangerous. This education can potentially prevent victimization. Programs that teach children about appropriate boundaries, about trusting their instincts, about reporting uncomfortable situations, have proven valuable. Research suggests that many child victims of abuse had uncomfortable feelings about the abuser but didn't report them because the abuser was someone trusted by adults, like a teacher, coach, or family friend. Teaching children that it's okay to report when something feels wrong, even if it involves someone adults trust, can help protect them. The legal system has made improvements in response to lessons learned from serial killer cases, though challenges remain. Mandatory reporting laws for suspected abuse exist in all states, requiring certain professionals like teachers, doctors, and therapists to report suspected abuse to authorities. Better protocols for investigating missing persons have been implemented in many jurisdictions, with guidelines requiring thorough investigation rather than waiting periods before taking reports seriously. Victim support systems have improved, with victim advocacy programs helping families navigate the legal system and access resources. Victim impact statements are now allowed in most jurisdictions, giving families a voice in legal proceedings. Some states have enacted victims' rights amendments to their constitutions, providing legal protections for victims and their families. However, significant challenges remain in balancing civil liberties with public safety. We can't investigate everyone who seems slightly unusual or intrude into private lives without cause. The freedoms that make democratic society possible also create spaces where predators can operate. This tension between liberty and security is ongoing and doesn't have simple solutions. Resource limitations affect investigation quality significantly. Thorough investigations are expensive and time-consuming. Many law enforcement agencies, particularly in smaller jurisdictions, lack the resources to conduct extensive investigations of every suspicious circumstance. This means some warning signs may not be pursued as thoroughly as they should be. Advocacy for adequate funding for law enforcement training, forensic labs, and investigative resources is important. The digital age has created new challenges and new opportunities. Predators can now research victims online, learn about investigation techniques through the internet, communicate with potential victims through social media and apps. The same technology that can be used for investigation can also be used to facilitate crime. But these same technologies also leave extensive digital footprints that investigators can follow. The challenge is developing the expertise and tools to effectively use digital evidence while respecting privacy rights. This requires ongoing training for investigators, updated laws that address digital evidence, and cooperation from technology companies. Research into the psychology of predatory behavior continues to advance. Studies examining the neurobiological, psychological, and social factors that contribute to violent behavior help us understand why some people become predators while others with similar backgrounds don't. This research may eventually lead to better early intervention strategies, though predicting who will become violent remains extremely difficult. Some warning signs that research has identified as potentially significant include a history of escalating antisocial behavior, particularly involving violence, fascination with violence, weapons, or violent crime, cruelty to animals, collecting items associated with violence, lack of empathy or inability to form genuine emotional connections, manipulative behavior across multiple contexts, a pattern of violating others' boundaries, and significant inconsistencies between public presentation and private behavior. However, experts caution that these signs are not definitive. Many people might display one or more of these characteristics without being dangerous. Conversely, sophisticated predators may successfully hide all of these signs. The indicators should prompt careful attention and potentially further investigation, not immediate judgment or action. The role of mental health services in prevention is complex. While most people with mental illnesses are not violent, and most serial killers are not mentally ill in the clinical sense, better access to mental health services might help identify and intervene with individuals who are developing dangerous patterns of thought or behavior. Early intervention when concerning behaviors are identified could potentially prevent some violence, though this is difficult to prove and implement. Education about healthy relationships, appropriate sexuality, respect for boundaries, and emotional regulation starting from childhood may help prevent the development of predatory behavior in some cases. While we can't prevent all violence, creating a society that better addresses the factors that contribute to violent behavior could potentially reduce it. The media's role in covering these cases deserves consideration. While public awareness is important, the celebrity status sometimes afforded to serial killers may actually encourage certain individuals. Coverage that focuses on victims' humanity rather than the killer's notoriety, that provides useful information without sensationalizing violence, and that respects families' privacy while still informing the public serves society better than coverage that turns killers into infamous celebrities. Research continues into the neurobiology, psychology, and sociology of violent behavior. Each new study contributes to our collective understanding. Advances in brain imaging, genetics, psychology, and criminology all contribute to a more complete picture of how and why some people become predators. The hope is that future generations will be better equipped to protect themselves and their communities from those who would hide in plain sight. By understanding how these predators operate, by improving our systems for detection and response, by believing victims and taking reports seriously, by advancing forensic science and investigative techniques, we can work toward a safer future. But we must also be realistic. There will likely always be individuals who choose to harm others, and some of them will be skilled at hiding their true nature. Vigilance, awareness, and strong systems of justice and support remain essential. Conclusion: remembering the victims. As we've journeyed through these disturbing cases, examining how serial killers successfully hid in plain sight by maintaining convincing facades of normalcy, it's crucial that we end by refocusing on what matters most: the victims. Dennis Rader, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, Gary Ridgway, and Israel Keyes wouldn't be remembered at all if not for the lives they destroyed. The victims of these killers weren't statistics or case numbers. They were people, sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, friends and neighbors. They had dreams and aspirations. They had favorite foods and songs. They had inside jokes with friends and traditions with family. They had potential futures that were stolen from them. Joseph Otero, age 38, was a loving husband and father who'd moved his family from Puerto Rico to Wichita, Kansas, for better opportunities. He worked at the Coleman Company, providing for his family, building a life in America. Julie Otero, age 34, was a devoted mother who cared deeply for her 5 children. Joseph Jr., age 9, loved baseball and had dreams of playing professionally someday. Josephine, age 11, was a bright, creative student who loved drawing. Dennis Rader took all of them on a single winter morning, destroying an entire family and leaving 3 surviving Otero children orphaned and traumatized. Catherine Bright, age 21, was starting her adult life with excitement about the future. She worked at the Coleman Company and was known for her friendly personality and work ethic. When Rader attacked her, her brother Kevin was there and tried desperately to save her, sustaining a gunshot wound in the process. Catherine fought for her life, as evidenced by her defensive wounds, but ultimately succumbed to her injuries. Shirley Vian, age 26, was doing her best to raise 3 young children while dealing with illness. When Rader locked her children in the bathroom and killed their mother, he traumatized those children in ways that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Nancy Fox, age 25, was an independent young woman living on her own and working to support herself. Maureen Hedge, age 53, was a neighbor who lived just 6 doors down from Rader, close enough that he could watch her routines. Vicky Wegerle, age 28, was a talented pianist and devoted mother. Dolores Davis, age 62, was a beloved grandmother in her community. Each of these 10 confirmed victims of BTK had families who loved them, who reported them missing, who searched for answers, who grieved their loss. Their names deserve to be remembered. Joseph Otero, Julie Otero, Joseph Otero Jr., Josephine Otero, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wegerle, and Dolores Davis. John Wayne Gacy's 33 victims included many young men and boys who had their whole lives ahead of them. Timothy McCoy, age 16, was traveling through Chicago when he encountered Gacy. John Butkovich, age 17, worked for Gacy's construction company and disappeared in 1975. His family searched for him desperately, not knowing he was buried under Gacy's house. Darrell Sampson, 18, Randall Reffett, 15, Samuel Stapleton, 14. These were teenagers, some still in school, some just starting work, all with potential that would never be realized. Robert Peast, age 15, was the victim whose disappearance finally led to Gacy's capture. He was a good student, close to his family, excited about a potential job opportunity. His mother's determination to find her son and her insistence that police investigate Gacy led to the breakthrough that brought down one of America's most prolific serial killers. The Peast family's persistence demonstrates the importance of families advocating for their missing loved ones. 5 of Gacy's victims remain unidentified even today. Young men whose families may still wonder what happened to them, who may still hope they'll return home someday. These unidentified victims deserve names and recognition, and efforts continue to identify them through DNA and other forensic techniques. Ted Bundy's confirmed 30 victims, though the actual number may be higher, included bright, accomplished young women with promising futures. Linda Ann Healy, age 21, was a psychology student who worked as a radio announcer. She was intelligent, ambitious, and well-liked by everyone who knew her. Donna Gale Manson, 19, Susan Rancourt, 18, Kathy Parks, 20, Brenda Ball, 22, Georgianne Hawkins, 18. These women were students, workers, daughters, sisters. Janice Ott, age 23, worked as a probation caseworker, helping troubled youth. She was literally dedicating her life to helping others when Bundy killed her. Denise Nasland, age 19, worked as a computer programmer, a skilled professional building a career. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, both 21, were sorority sisters with their whole lives ahead of them. Kimberly Leach was only 12 years old, a child taken from her school, her life barely begun. Each of these women had families who loved them, friends who missed them, potential that was destroyed. They deserved long lives, the opportunity to accomplish their goals, to love and be loved, to contribute to the world. Bundy stole all of that from them. Gary Ridgway's 49 confirmed victims were women who deserve to be remembered with dignity and respect. Many were vulnerable women struggling with addiction or poverty, some engaged in sex work to survive. Their vulnerability didn't make their lives less valuable. It made their murders even more tragic because they were already in difficult circumstances and needed help, not violence. Wendy Lee Caulfield, age 16, was a runaway who could have been helped, who could have gotten her life back on track. Tammy Lyles, age 16, and Lori Ann Raspotnik, age 15, were just children who ran away from difficult home situations and encountered a predator instead of safety. These young women needed protection and support, not murder. Many of Ridgway's victims were adults, trying to survive difficult circumstances. Deborah Bonner, 23, Marcia Chapman, 31, Giselle Lovvorn, 17, Opal Mills, 16, Cynthia Hines, 17. Each had a story, a family, a life that mattered. The fact that some struggled with addiction or engaged in sex work doesn't make their murders less tragic or their lives less valuable. Israel Keyes's confirmed victims, Bill Currier, age 50, Lorraine Currier, age 55, and Samantha Koenig, age 18, represent just a fraction of the lives he may have destroyed. Bill was an engineer, Lorraine a registered nurse. They'd been married for years, living their normal lives in Vermont. Their abduction and murder shocked their community, and the fact that their bodies were never found denied their family the closure of proper burial. Samantha Koenig was just 18 years old, working at a coffee stand to save money, making plans for her future. She was taken in a random act of violence by a killer who specifically traveled around the country to commit crimes that couldn't be connected. Her abduction galvanized her community and led to the intensive investigation that ultimately captured Keyes. There are likely other victims of Israel Keyes whose families don't even know their loved ones were murdered by him. He hinted at murders in various states but died before revealing details. Some families may never get answers. The victims of these killers, all of them, deserve to be remembered as people first, as individuals with their own stories, their own worth, their own importance that exists independently of the killers who took their lives. They were people who laughed and cried, who had favorite movies and foods, who had dreams and fears, who loved and were loved. Their families have shown remarkable courage. Some have worked to change laws, to improve how missing persons are investigated, to ensure that other families don't suffer as they have. Some have simply tried to survive their grief, to find a way to keep living in a world that has become unimaginably painful. All of them deserve our respect, our compassion, and our support. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the National Organization for Victim Assistance, and various state and local victim advocacy groups work to support families of victims, to improve investigation and prosecution of crimes, and to ensure that victims' voices are heard in the legal system. These organizations deserve support from those who want to honor victims and prevent future tragedies. As we've explored the disturbing reality of serial killers who hide in plain sight, we've learned important lessons about how predators operate, how social psychology can be exploited, how systems can fail, and how forensic science and investigation techniques continue to improve. But the most important lesson is this: we must never allow the fascination with the killer to eclipse the humanity of their victims. The victims of BTK, of Gacy, of Bundy, of Ridgway, of Keyes, and of countless others deserve more than to be remembered merely as statistics in someone else's story. They deserve to be remembered as the people they were, as the potential they represented, as the holes they left in the hearts of those who loved them. Understanding how killers hide in plain sight, how they successfully deceive communities and families is valuable. This knowledge can potentially save lives by improving our ability to recognize warning signs, by enhancing investigative techniques, by making us all more aware of the realities of predatory behavior. But we must never lose sight of why this understanding matters. Because real people with real families, with real dreams and potential, deserve protection. They deserve justice, and they deserve to be remembered. As you move through your own life, take from these stories what is useful. Be aware that danger doesn't always look dangerous. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Take seriously reports of concerning behavior, especially from vulnerable people, whose reports might otherwise be dismissed. Support systems that protect the vulnerable. Advocate for adequate resources for law enforcement and victim services. Remember that the victims of violent crime deserve dignity, respect, and justice. But above all, remember the names, remember the faces, remember the lives, because in the end, the only reason we talk about the killers at all is because of the people they killed. The victims are what matter. Their memory is what we must honor. Their lives are what we must remember. Thank you for joining me on this difficult journey through some of the darkest chapters of criminal history. These stories are painful, but they're important. They remind us to be vigilant, to be compassionate, to believe victims, and to never take safety for granted. If you found this presentation informative and handled with appropriate respect for the victims and their families, please like and subscribe to support this channel. Your support helps me continue creating well-researched, respectful true crime content that honors victims while educating about the realities of crime and justice. Take care of yourselves. Look out for each other. And remember, the most effective defense against predators is a community that pays attention, that believes victims, and that refuses to let evil hide in plain sight. This presentation is dedicated to the memory of all victims of violent crime and to their families who carry on despite unimaginable loss. Final word count, 21,847 words.